"No, he knows that," answered Mary sadly. "I sometimes think you'll never get work again. And that trade will never mend. It's very hard to keep up one's heart. I wish I were a boy. I'd go to sea with you. It will be getting away from bad news at any rate. And now, there's hardly a creature that crosses the doorstep but has something sad and unhappy to tell. One father is going as a delegate from his union to ask help from the Glasgow folk. He's starting this evening," Mary sighed for. The feeling again came over her that it was very flat to be left behind. You say no one crosses the threshold but has something sad to say. You don't mean that Margaret Jennings has any trouble?" asked the young sailor anxiously. "No," replied Mary, smiling a little. "She's the only one I know, I believe, who seems free from care. Her blindness almost appears a blessing sometimes. She was so downhearted when she dreaded it. And now she seems so calm and happy. Now it's downright calm. Margaret's happy, I do think. I could almost wish it had been otherwise." Said well thoughtfully, "I could have been so glad to comfort her and cherish her if she had been in trouble." "And why can't you cherish her even though she's happy?" asked Mary. "Oh, I don't know. She seems so much better than I am, and her voice when I hear it and think of the wishes that are in my heart. It seems as much out of place to ask her to be my wife as it would be to ask an angel from heaven." Mary could not help laughing outright. In spite of her depression at the idea of Margaret as an angel, it was so difficult even to her dress, making imagination to fancy wear, and how the wings would be fastened to the brown stuff gown or the blue and yellow print. Will laugh too, a little, out of sympathy with Mary's pretty merry laugh. Then he said, "Ah, you may laugh, Mary. It only shows you've never been in love." In an instant Mary was carnation color, and the tears sprang to her soft gray eyes. She was suffering so much from the doubts arising from love, it was unkind of him. He did not notice her change of look and of complexion. He only noticed that she was silent, so he continued, I think that when I come back from this voyage, I will speak. It's my 4th voyage in the same ship, and with the same captain, and he's promised he'll make me second mate after this trip. Then I should have something to offer Margaret, and a father and Aunt Alice shall live with her, to keep her from being lonesome while I'm at sea. I'm speaking as if she cared for me and would marry me. Do you think she does care at all for me?" Mary asked anxiously. Mary had a very decided opinion of her own on the subject, but she did not feel as if she had any right to give it. So she said, "You must ask Margaret, not me, Will. She's never named your name to me." His countenance fell. "But I should say, that was a good sign from a girl like her. I've no right to say what I think, but if I was you, I would not leave her now without speaking." "No, I cannot speak. I've tried. I've been in to wish them goodbye ... and my voice stuck in my throat. I could say no to what I planned to say, and I never thought of being so bold as to offer her marriage till I be in my next trip and been mad mate. I could not even offer her this box," said he, undoing his paper parcel, displaying a gaudily ornamented accordion ... along to buy something. "And I thought if it was something in the music line, she would maybe fancy it more, so will you give it to her, Mary, when I'm gone? And if you can slip in something tender, something you know of what I feel, maybe she would listen to you, Mary." Mary promised that she would do all that he asked. "I should be thinking on her many and many a night, when I'm keeping my watch in mid-sea. I wonder if she will ever think on me, when the wind is whistling and the gale rising. You often speak of me to a Mary, and if I should meet with any mischance, tell her how dear, how very dear she was to me, and bitter for the sake of one who loved her. Well, try and comfort my poor Aunt Alice, dear old aunt. You and Margaret will often go and see her, won't you? She sadly failed since I was last ashore, and so good as she's been when I lived with her, a little wee chap, I used to be awakened by the neighbors knocking her up. This one was Erlo, that body's child was restless, and for as tired as ever she might be, she would be open dressed in a twinkling, never thinking of a hard day's washer for her next morning. Then were happy times, how happy I used to be, when she would take me into the fields with her to gather herbs. I tasted tea in China since then, but it was not half so good as the herb tea she used to make for me on Sunday nights, and she knew such a deal about plants and birds and their ways. She used to tell me long stories about her childhood, and we used to plan how we would go sometime. Please God, that was always her word, and live near her old home beyond Lancaster, in the very cottage where she was born, if we could get it. Dear, and how different it is here, is she, still in the backstreet of Manchester, never likely to see her home again. And I a sailor off for America next week. I wish she'd been able to go to Burton once, before she died. She would maybe have found all sadly changed, said Mary, though her heart echoed Will's feeling. I dare say it's best. One thing I do wish though, and I've often wished it when out alone on the deep sea, when even the most thoughtless cannot choose but think on past and the future, and that is that I've never grieved, oh Mary. Many a hasty word comes solely back on the heart, when one thinks someone should never see the person whom one has grieved again. They both stood thinking. Suddenly Mary started. That's Father's step, and his shirt's not ready. She hurried to her hands and tried to make up for last time. John Barton came in, such a haggard and wildly anxious-looking man. Will thought he had never seen. He looked at Will, but spoke no word of greeting or welcome. I've come to bid you goodbye, said the sailor, and word, in his sociable, friendly humor, have gone on speaking. But John answered abruptly, goodbye to you then. There was that in his manner which left no doubt of his desire to get rid of the visitor. And Will accordingly shook hands with Mary and looked at John, as if doubting how far to offer to shake hands with him. But he met with no answering glance or gesture, so he went his way, stopping for an instant to the door to say, you'll think on me on Tuesday, Mary. That's the day we shall hoist our Blue Peter. Jack Harris says Mary was heartily sorry when the door closed. It seemed like shutting out a friendly sunbeam. And her father, what could be the matter with him? He was so restless, not speaking. She wished he would, but starting up, and then sitting down and meddling with her hands. He seemed so fierce to judge from his face. She wondered if he disliked Will being there, or if he were vexed to find that she not got further on with her work. At last she could bear his nervous way no longer. It made her equally nervous and fidgety. She would speak. When are you going, Father? I don't know the time at trains, and why should they know? Replied he gruffly, meddle with ironing, but do not be asking questions about what does not concern thee. I wanted to get you something to eat first, answered she gently. That does not know that I'm learning to do without food, said he. Mary looked at him to see if he spoke jestingly. No, he looked savagely grave. She finished her bit of ironing and began preparing the food she was sure her father needed, for by this time her experience in the degrees of hunger had taught her that his present irritability was increased, if not caused by want of food. He had had a sovereign given to him to pay his expenses as delegate to Glasgow, and out of this he'd given Mary a few shillings in the morning, so she'd been able to buy a sufficient meal, and now her care was to cook it so as most to tempt him. If they are doing that for me, Mary, then we spared our labor. I tell thee I will not for eating. Just a little bit farther before starting coast, Mary perseveringly. At that instant who should come in but Joe Blake? It was not often he came, but when he did pay visits, Mary knew from past experience they were anything but short. Her father's countenance fell back into the deep gloom from which it was but just emerging at the sound of Mary's sweet voice. And pretty bleeding, he became again restless and fidgety, scarcely giving Job leg, the greeting necessary for the host in his own house. Job, however, did not stand upon ceremony. He had come to pay a visit, and was not to be daunted from his purpose. He was interested in John Barton's mission to Glasgow, and wanted to hear all about it. So he sat down and made himself comfortable, in a manner that Mary saw was meant to be stationary. So out of the Glasgow are now. He began his catechism. I went out starting tonight. That an old but by what train? That was just what Mary wanted to know. But what apparently her father was in no mood to tell. He got up without speaking and went upstairs. Mary knew from his step and his way how much he was put out and feared Job would see it. To but no Job seemed impe table. So much the better, and perhaps she could cover her father's rudeness by her own civility to so kind a friend. So half listening to her father's movements upstairs, passionate, violent, restless motions they were, and half attending to Joe Blake, she tried to pay him all due regard. When does your father start, Mary? That plaguing question again. Oh, very soon. I'm just getting him a bit of supper. Is Margaret very well? Yes, she's well enough. She's meaning to go and keep Alice Wilson company for an hour or so this evening, as soon as she thinks her nephew will have started for Liverpool, for she fancies the old woman will feel a bit lonesome. The union is paying for your father, I suppose. Yes, they've given him a sovereign. You're one of the union, Job. I am one, sure enough, but I'm but a sleeping partner in the concern. I would oblige to become a member for peace, as I don't go along with him, you see. They think themselves wise and me silly for differing with them. Well, there's no harm in that, but then they won't let me be silly in peace and quietness, but will force me to be as wise as they are. Now that's not British liberty. I say I'm forced to be wise according to their notions, else they prosecute me and serve me out. What could her father be doing upstairs? Tramping and banging about. Why did he not come down, or why did not Job go? The supper would be spoiled, but Job had no notion of going. You see, my folly is this, Mary. I would take what I would get. I think buffalo is better than no bread. I would work for low wages rather than sit idle and starve. But comes a trade union and says, well, if you take the half, love will worry you out of your life. Will you be clemmed, or will you be worried? Now climbing is a quiet death and worrying isn't. So I choose climbing and combat at the union. But I wish they'd leave me free if I am a fool. Creak, creak went the stairs. Her father was coming down at last. Yes, he came down, but more doggedly fierce than before, and made up for his journey too, with his little bundle on his arm. He went up to Job, and more civilly than Mary expected, wished him goodbye. He then turned to her and in a short, cold manner bade her farewell. Oh, father, don't go yet, your supper's already. Stay one moment. But he pushed her away and was gone. She followed him to the door, her eyes blinded by sudden tears. She stood there looking after him. He was so strange, so cold, so hard. Suddenly at the end of the court, he turned and saw her standing there. He came back quickly and took her in his arms. God bless thee, Mary. God in heaven bless thee, poor child. She threw her arms around his neck. Don't go yet, father. I can't bear you to go yet. Come in and eat some supper. You look so ghastly, dear father, do. No, he said faintly and mournfully. It's best as it is. I could not eat, and it's best to be off. I cannot be still at home. I must be moving. So saying, he unleashed her soft, twining arms, and kissing her once more, set off on his fierce errand. But he was out of sight. She did not know why, but she had never before felt so depressed, so desolate. She turned into Job, who sat there still. Her father, as soon as he was out of sight, slackened his pace and fell into that heavy, listless step which told, as well as words could do, of hopelessness and weakness. It was getting dark, but he lighted on, returning no greeting to anyone. A child's cry caught his ear. His thoughts were running on. "Little Tom, I'm a dead and buried child of happier years." He followed the sound of the wail that might have been his, and found a poor little mortal who had lost his way, and his grief had choked up his thoughts to the single, "Want mommy, mommy," with tender address. John Barton soothed the little laddie, and with beautiful patience, he gathered fragments of meaning from the half-spoken words, which came, mingled with sobs from the terrified little heart. So aided by inquiries here and there from a passerby, he led and carried the little fellow home, where his mother had been too busy to miss him, but now received him with thankfulness and with an eloquent Irish blessing. When John heard the words of blessing, he shook his head mournfully and turned away to retrace his steps. "Let us leave him." Mary took her sewing after he had gone, and sat on trying to listen to Job, who was more inclined to talk than usual. She had conquered her feeling of impatience towards him, so far as to be able to offer him her father's rejected supper, and she even tried to eat herself, but her heart failed her. A leaden weight seemed to hang over her, a sort of presentiment of evil, or perhaps only an excessive low-spirited feeling, and consequence of the two departures which are taken place that afternoon. She wondered how long Job Legg would sit. She did not like putting down her work and crying before him, and yet she had never in her life longed so much to be alone. In order to indulge a good, hearty burst of tears, "Well, Mary," she suddenly caught him saying, "I thought you'd be a bit lonely tonight, and as Margaret were going to cheer the old woman, I said I'd go and keep the young and company. And a very pleasant chatty evening we've had. Very. Only I wonder is Margaret has not come back." "But perhaps she is," suggested Mary. "No, no. I don't care of that. Look here." And he pulled out the great house key. "She left to stand waiting in the street, and that I'm sure she wouldn't do when she knew where to find me. Well, she come back by herself?" asked Mary. At first I was afraid of trusting her, and I used to follow her a bit behind, never letting on, of course. Well, bless you, she goes along as steadily as can be, rather slow to be sure, and her head a bit on one side as if she were listening, and it's real beautiful to see across the road. She wait above a bit to hear that all is still, not that she's so dark as not to see a coach or a car, like a big black thing, but you can't rightly judge how far off it is by sight. So she listens. Hark, that's her. Yes, and she came with her. Usually calm face, all tears stained and sorrow marked. "What's the matter, my wench?" said Joe pastily. "Oh, grandfather, Alice Wilson so bad." She could say no more for her breathless agitation. The afternoon and the parting with Will had weakened her nerves for any aftershock. "What is it? Don't tell us." "Margaret," said Mary, placing her in a chair and loosening her bonnet strings. "I think it's a stroke of the palsy. At any rate, she's lost the use of one side." "Was it a four-wheeler set off?" asked Mary. "No, he were gone before I got there, said Margaret, "and you were much about as well as she had been this many a day." She spoke a bit, but not much, but that were only natural for Mrs. Wilson likes to have the talk to herself. You know, she got up to go across the room, and then I heard a drag with her leg, and presently a fall, and Mrs. Wilson came running and set up such a cry. I stopped with Alice while she fetched the doctor, but she could not speak to answer me, though she tried, I think. "Where was Jim? Why didn't he go for the doctor?" "He went out when I got there, and he never came home." While I stopped, that was never left Mrs. Wilson alone. "Where poor Alice?" asked Job hastily. "No, no," said Margaret, "but oh, grandfather, it's now I feel how hard it is to have lost my sight. I should have so loved a nurse, and I did try until I found I did more harm than good. Oh, grandfather, if I could but see." She sobbed a little, and they let her give that ease to her heart. Then she went on, "No, I went round by Mrs. Davenport's and she were hard at work. But the minute I told my errand, she were ready and willing to go to Jane Wilson and stop up all night with Alice. And what does the doctor say?" Ask Mario. "What should all doctors say? He puts a fence on this side and a fence on that. The fear he should be caught tripping in his judgment. One moment he does not think there's much hope, but while there is life there is hope. The next he says he should think she might recover. Partial but her age is a beginner. He's ordered her leeches to her." Head. Margaret, having told her tale, leant back with weirdness, both of body and mind. Mary hastened to make her a cup of tea, while Job, lately so talkative, sat quiet and mournfully silent. "I'll go first thing tomorrow morning ... and learn how she is. And I'll bring word back before I go to work," said Mary. "It's a bad job Will's gone," said Joe. "Jane does not think she knows anyone," replied Margaret. "It's perhaps as well he shouldn't see her now, but they say her face is sadly drawn. He'll remember her with her own face better, if he does not see her again," with a few more sorrowful remarks. They separated for the night, and Mary was left alone in her house to meditate on the heavy day that had passed. Over her head, everything seemed going wrong. Will gone, her father gone, and so strangely too, and to a place so mysteriously distant, as Glasgow seemed to be to her. She had felt his presence as a protection against Harry Carson and his threats, and now she dreaded lest he should learn she was alone. Her heart began to despair too. About Jem she feared he had ceased to love her, and she only loved him more and more for his seeming neglect. And as if all this aggregate of sorrowful thoughts was not enough, here was this new woe of poor Alice's paralytic stroke. Chapter 18. But in his pulse there was no throb, nor on his lips one dying sob. Sigh nor word, nor struggling breath heralded his way to death. Siege of Corinth, my brain runs this way and that way. It will not fix on aught but vengeance. Duke of Guise, I must now go back to an hour or two before Mary and her friends parted for the night. It might be about 8 o'clock that evening, and the three Miss Carsons were sitting in their father's drawing room. He was asleep in the dining room, in his own comfortable chair. Mrs. Carson was, as was usual with her, when no particular excitement was going on, very poorly and sitting upstairs in her dressing room, indulging in the luxury of a headache. She was not well, certainly whined in the head, the servants called it, but it was but the natural consequence of the state of mental and bodily idleness in which she was placed, without education enough to value the resources of wealth and leisure. She was so circumstanced as to command both. It would have done her more good than all the ether and salve latterly. She was daily in the habit of swallowing, if she might have taken the work of one of her own housemates, for a week made beds, rubbed tables, shaken carpets, and gone out into the fresh morning air, without all the paraphernalia of shore cloak, bower, fur boots, bonnet, and veil in which she was equipped before setting out for an airing, in the closely shut-up carriage. So the three girls were by themselves in a comfortable, elegant, well-lighted drawing room, and like many similarly situated young ladies, they did not exactly know what to do to while away the time until the tea hour. The elder two had been at a dancing party the night before, and were listless and sleepy. In consequence, one tried to read Emerson's essays and fell asleep in the attempt. The other was turning over a parcel of new music in order to select what she liked. Amy, the youngest, was copying some manuscript music. The air was heavy, with a fragrance of strongly scented flowers, which sent out their night orders from an adjoining conservatory. The clock on the chimney piece chimed 8. Sophie, the sleeping sister, started up at the sound. "What o'clock is that?" she asked. "8," said Amy. "Oh dear, how tired I am. Is Harry coming?" Tea would rouse one up a little. "Are you not worn out, Helen?" Yes, I am tired enough. What is good for nothing the day after a dance? It don't feel weary at the time. I suppose it is the lateness of the hours. And yet how could it be managed otherwise? So many don't die until 5 or 6. The one cannot begin before 8 or 9. And then it takes a long time to get into the spirit of the evening. It is always more pleasant after supper than before. Well, I'm too tired tonight to reform the world. In the matter of dances or balls, what are you copying, Amy? Only that little Spanish air you sing, Quien Quira. What are you copying it for? Asked Ellen. Harry asked me to do it for him this morning. At breakfast time for Mr. Richardson, he said. Jane Richardson, said Sophie, as if a new idea were receiving strength in her mind. Do you think Harry means anything by his attention to her? Asked Helen. Me, I do not know anything more than you do. I can only observe and conjecture. What do you think, Helen? Harry always likes to be of consequence. To the belle of the room. If one girl is more admired than another, he likes to flutter about her and seems to be on intimate terms with her. That's his way. And I've not noticed anything beyond that. And his manager, Jane Richardson, but I don't think she knows it's only his way. Just watch her the next time we meet her when Harry's there, and see how she crimsons and looks another way when she feels he's coming up to her. I think he sees it too, and I think he's pleased with it. I dare say Harry would like well enough to turn the head of such a lovely girl as Jane Richardson, but I'm not convinced that he is in love. Whatever she may be, well. Then, said Sophie indignantly, though it is our own brother, I don't think he's behaving very wrongly. The more I think of it, the more sure I am that she thinks he means something, and that he intends her to think so. And then when he leaves off paying her attention, which will be as soon as a prettier girl makes her appearance, interrupted Helen. As soon as he leaves off paying her attention, resumed Sophie, she will have many and many a heartache, and then she will harden herself into being a flirt, a feminine flirt as he is, a masculine flirt, poor girl. I don't like to hear you speak so of Harry, said Amy, looking up at Sophie. But I don't like to have to speak so, Amy, for I love him dearly. He's a good, kind brother, but I do think in vain, and I think he hardly knows the misery, the crimes to which indulged vanity may lead him. Helen yawned. Do you think we're marrying for tea? Sleeping after dinner always makes me so feverish. Yes, surely. Why should not we? To the more energetic Sophie, pulling the bell with some determination. Tea directly, Parker, said she authoritatively as the man entered the room. She was too little in the habit of reading expressions on the faces of others. To notice Parker's countenance. Yet it was striking. It was blanched to a dead whiteness, the lips compressed, as if to keep within some tale of horror, the eyes distended and unnatural. It was a terror-stricken face. The girls began to put away their music and books. In preparation for tea, the door slowly opened again, and this time it was the nurse who entered. I called her nurse, for such had been her office in bygone days, though now she held rather an anomalous situation in the family. Seamstress attendant on the young ladies, keeper of the store's only nurse was still her name. She had lived longer with them than any other servant, and to her their manner was far less haughty than to the other domestics. She occasionally came into the drawing room to look for things belonging to their father or mother, so it did not excite any surprise. When she advanced into the room, they went on arranging their various articles of employment. She wanted them to look up. She wanted them to read something in her face so full of woe, of horror. But they went on without taking any notice. She coughed, not a natural cough, but one of those coughs which ask so plainly for a mark. Dear nurse, what's the matter? Ask Amy, are you not well? Is my mile? Asked Sophie quickly. Speak, speak, nurse. So they all, as they saw her efforts to articulate, choked by the convulsive rising in her throat, they clustered round her. with eager faces, catching a glimpse of some terrible truth. To be revealed, my dear young ladies, my dear girls. She gasped out at length, and then she burst into tears. Oh, do tell us what it is. Nurse said anything is better than this. Speak. My children, I don't know how to break it to you. My dears, poor Mr. Harry is brought home. Brought home, brought home. How instinctively they sank their voices to a whisper, but a fearful whisper. It was in the same low tone as if afraid lest the walls, the furniture, the inanimate things, which told of preparation for life and comfort, should hear. She answered, dead. Amy clutched her nurse's arm and fixed her eyes on her, as if to know if such a tale could be true, and when she read its confirmation in those sad, mournful, unflinching eyes, she sank without word or sound. Down in a faint upon the floor, one sister sat down on an ottoman and covered her face. To try and realize it, that was Sophie. Helen threw herself on the sofa, and burying her head in the pillows, tried to stifle the screams and moans which shook her frame. The nurse stood silent. She had not told all. Tell me, said Sophie, looking up and speaking in a hoarse voice, which told of the inward pain. Tell me, nurse, is he dead, did you say? Have you sent for a doctor? Oh, send for one. Send for one, continued she, her voice rising to shrillness and starting to her feet. Helen lifted herself up and looked with breathless waiting towards nurse. My dears, he's dead. But I have sent for a doctor. I've done all I could. When did they bring him home? Asked Sophie. Perhaps 10 minutes ago, before you rang for Pearson. How did he die? Where did they find him? He looks so well. He always seems so strong. Oh, are you sure he's dead? She went towards the door. Nurse laid her hand on her arm. Miss Sophie, I've not told you all. Can you bear to hear it? Remember, Master's in the next room, and he knows nothing yet. Come, you must help me to tell him now. Be quiet, dear. It was no common death. He died. She looked in her face, as if trying to convey her meaning by her eyes. Sophie's lips moved, but nurse could hear no sound. He has been shot as he was coming along Turner Street tonight. Sophie went on with the motion of her lips, twitching them almost convulsively. My dear, you must rouse yourself, and remember, your father and mother have yet to be told. Speak, Miss Sophie. But she could not. Her whole face worked involuntarily. The nurse left the room, and almost immediately brought back some salva, latterly, and water. Sophie drank it eagerly and gave one or two deep gasps. Then she spoke in a calm, unnatural voice. What do you want me to do, nurse? Go to Helen and poor Amy. See, they won't help. Poor creatures, we must let them alone for a bit. You must go to Master. That's what I want you to do. Miss Sophie, you must break it to him. Poor old gentleman. Come, he's asleep in the dining room, and the men are waiting to speak to him. Sophie went mechanically to the dining room door. Oh, I cannot go in. I cannot tell him. What must I say? I'll come with you, Miss Sophie. Break it to him by degrees. I can't, nurse, my head throbs, so I should be sure to say the wrong thing. However, she opened the door. There sat her father, the shaded light of the candle lamp falling upon and softening his marked features, while his snowy hair contrasted well with the deep crimson morocco of the chair. The newspaper he'd been reading had dropped on the carpet by his side. He breathes regularly and deeply. At that instant, the words of Mrs. Human's song came full into Sophie's mind. You know not what to do that. Call the slumberer back from the realms unseen by you, to life's dim, weary track. But this life's track would be to the bereaved father, something more than dim and weary hereafter. Papa, said she softly. He did not stir. Papa, she exclaimed somewhat louder. He started up half awake. D is ready, is it? And he yawned. No, Papa, but something very dreadful, very sad has happened. He was gaping so loud that he did not catch the words she uttered, and did not see the expression of her face. Master Henry has not come back, said nurse, her voice heard in unusual speech to him. arrested his attention, and rubbing his eyes, he looked at the servant. Harry, oh no. He had to attend the meeting of the masters about these cursed turnouts. I don't expect him yet. What are you looking at me so strangely for, Sophie? Oh, Papa, Harry has come back, said she, bursting into tears. What do you mean, said he, startled into an impatient consciousness that something was wrong. Olivia says he's not come home, and the other says he is. Now that's nonsense. Tell me at once what's the matter. Did he go on horseback to town? Is he thrown? Speak, child. Can't you? No, he's not been thrown, Papa, said Sophie sadly, but he's badly hurt. But the nurse desires to be drawing his anxiety to a point. Hurt where? How have you sent for a doctor? Said he, hastily rising as if to leave the room. Yes, Papa, we've sent for a doctor, but I'm afraid I believe it's of no use. He looked at her for a moment, and in her face he read the truth. His son, his only son, was dead. He sank back in his chair and hid his face in his hands and about his head upon the table. The strong mahogany dining table shook and rattled under his agony. Sophie went and put her arms around his bowed neck. Go. You're not Harry, said he, but the action roused him. Where is he? Where is said he with his strong face set into the lines of anguish by 2 minutes of such intense woe. In the servants' hall, said nurse. To policeman, and another man brought him home. They would be glad to speak to you when you're able, sir. I'm able now, replied he. At first, when he stood up, he tottered, but steadying himself, he walked as firmly as a soldier on drill to the door. Then he turned back and poured out a glass of wine from a decanter, which yet remained on the table. His eye caught the wine glass, which Harry had used but 2 or 3 hours before. He sighed a long, quivering sigh, and then, mastering himself, again he left the room. You would better go back to your sisters, Miss Sophie, said nurse. Miss Carson went. She could not face death. Yet the nurse followed Mr. Carson to the servants' hall. There on their dinner table lay the poor dead body. The men who had brought it were sitting near the fire, while several of the servants stood around the table, gazing at the remains. One or two were crying, one or two were whispering, or into a strange stillness of voice and action. By the presence of the dead, when Mr. Carson came in, they all drew back and looked at him with a reverence due to sorrow. He went forward and gazed long and fondly on the calm, dead face, but he bent down and kissed the lips, yet crimson with life. The policeman had advanced and stood ready to be questioned, but at first the old man's mind could only take in the idea of death slowly. Slowly came the conception of violence, of murder. How did he die? He groaned forth. The policemen looked at each other. Then one began and stated that, having heard the report of a gun in Turner Street, he had turned down that way, a lonely, unfrequented way Mr. Carson knew, but a shortcut to his garden door, of which Harry had a key. But as he, the policeman, came nearer, he'd heard footsteps as of a man running away, but the evening was so dark, the moon not having yet risen, that he could see no one 20 yards off. But he had even been startled when close to the body, by seeing it lying across the path at his feet. But he had sprung his rattle, and when another policeman came up, by the light of the lantern, they had discovered who it was that had been killed, that they believed him to be dead when they first took him up, as he had never moved, spoken, or breathed. That intelligence of the murder had been sent to the superintendent, who would probably soon be here. The 2 or 3 policemen were still about the place where the murder was committed, seeking out for some trace of the murderer. Having said this, they stopped speaking. Mr. Carson had listened attentively, never taking his eyes off the dead body. When they had ended, he said, "Where was he shot?" They lifted up some of the thick chestnut curls and showed a blue spot. You could hardly call it a hole. The flesh had closed so much over it in the left temple, A deadly aim, and yet it was so dark at night. It must have been close upon him, said one policeman. And of atom between him and the sky, added the other. There was a little commotion at the door of the room, and there stood poor Mrs. Carson, the mother. She had heard unusual noises in the house, and had sent down her maid, much more a companion to her than her highly educated daughters, to discover what was going on. But the maid either forgot or dreaded to return, and with nervous impatience Mrs. Carson came down herself, and had traced the harm and bars of voices. To the servants' hall, Mr. Carson turned around, but he could not leave the dead for anyone living. Take her away, nurse. There's no sight for her. Tell Miss Sophie to go to. Her mother, his eyes were again fixed on the dead face of his son. Presently Mrs. Carson's hysterical cries were heard all over the house. Her husband, shattered at the outward expression of the agony, which was rendering his heart. Then the police superintendent came, and after him the doctor. The latter went through all the forms of ascertaining death, without uttering a word, and when at the conclusion of the operation, of opening a vein from which no blood flowed, he shook his head. All present understood the confirmation of their previous belief. The superintendent asked to speak to Mr. Carson in private. It was just what I was going to request of you. Answer T. So he led the way into the dining room, with the wine glass still on the table. The door was carefully shut. And both sat down, each apparently waiting for the other to begin. At last Mr. Carson spoke. You probably have heard that I'm a rich man. The superintendent bowed in assent. Well, sir. Half-knee, if necessary. The whole of my fortune I will give to have the murderer brought to the gallows. Every exertion, you may be sure, sir, should be used on our part, but probably offering a handsome reward might accelerate the discovery of the murderer. But what I wanted particularly to tell you, sir, is that one of my men has already got some clue, and that another who accompanied me here, as within this quarter of an hour, found a gun in the field which the murderer crossed, and what she probably threw away when pursued, as encumbering his flight. I have not the smallest doubt of discovering the murderer. What do you call a handsome reward? Said Mr. Carson. Well, sir, £300 or £500 is a magnificent reward, more than will probably be required. As a temptation to any accomplice, make it 1,000, said Mr. Carson decisively. Is the doing of these damn turnouts? I imagine not, said the superintendent. Some days ago the man I was naming to you before repeated to the inspector, when he came on his beat, that he had to separate your son from a young man who, by his dress he believed to be employed in a foundry, that the man had thrown Mr. Carson down, and seemed inclined to proceed to more violence, when the policeman came up and interfered. Indeed, my man wished to give him in charge for an assault, but Mr. Carson would not allow that to be done. Just like him, noble fellow, murmured the father. But after your son had left, the man made use of some pretty strong threats, and it's rather a curious coincidence that this scuffle took place in the very same spot where the murder was committed. Internal street. There was someone knocking at the door of the room. It was Sophie, who beckoned her father out, and then asked him in an awestruck whisper to come upstairs and speak to her mother. She will not leave Harry and talk so strangely. Indeed, Papa, I think she's lost her senses. And the poor girl sobbed bitterly. Where is she? Asked Mr. Carson in his room. They went upstairs rapidly and silently. It was a large, comfortable bedroom, too large to be well lighted by the flickering kitchen candle, which should be hastily snatched up, and now stood on the dressing table. On the bed, surrounded by its heavy pool-like green curtains, lay the dead son. They had carried him up and laid him down as tenderly as though they feared to waken him, and indeed it looked more like sleep than death. So very calm and full of repose was the face you saw, to the chiseled beauty of the features much more perfectly than. When the brilliant coloring of life had distracted your attention, there was a peace about him that told death had come, too instantaneously to give any previous pain. In a chair at the head of the bed sat the mother. Smiling, she held one of the hands, rapidly stiffening even in her warm grasp, and gently stroked the back of it with the endearing caress she had used to all her children. When young, "I'm glad you come," she said, looking up at her husband and still smiling. "Harry's so full of fun. He always has something new to amuse us with. And now he pretends he's asleep and that we can't awaken him. Look, he's smiling now. He is I found him out, look." And in truth, the lips in the rest of death did look as though they wore a smile, and the waving light of the unsnaffed candle almost made them seem to move. "Look, Amy," said she, tell youngest child who knelt at her feet, trying to soothe her by kissing her garments. "Oh, he was always a rogue, you remember. Don't you love how full of play he was as a baby?" adding, "His face under my arm when he wanted to play with him. Always a rogue, Harry." "We must get it away, sir," said nurse. "You know, there's much to be done before I understand this," said the father hastily, interrupting her, in dread of the distinct words which would tell her the changes of mortality. "Come, love," said he to his wife, "I want you to come with me. I want to speak to you downstairs." "I'm coming," said she, rising. "Perhaps after all, nurse, he's really tired and would be glad to sleep. Don't let him get cold, though he feels rather chilly," continued she, after she had bent down and kissed the pale lips. Her husband put his arm around her waist, and they left the room. Then the three sisters burst into unrestrained wailings. They were startled into the reality of life and death, and yet in the midst of shrieks and moans, of shivering and chattering of teeth, Sophie's eye caught the calm beauty of the dead, so calm amidst such violence, and she hushed her emotion. "Come," said she to her sisters, "Nurse wants us to go, and besides, we ought to be with Mama. Papa told the man he was talking to when I went for him to wait, and she must not be left." Meanwhile, the superintendent had taken a candle and was examining the engravings that hang around the dining room. It was so common to him to be acquainted with crime that he was far from feeling all his interest absorbed in the present case of violence. Although he could not help having much anxiety to detect the murderer, he was busy looking at the only oil painting in the room, a youth of 18 or so in a fancy dress, and conjecturing its identity with a young man so mysteriously dead, when the door opened and Mr. Carson returned. Stern as he had looked before leaving the room, he looked faster now. His face was hardened into deep purposed wrath. "I beg your pardon, sir, for leaving you." The superintendent bowed. They sat down and spoke long together. One by one the policemen were called in and questioned. All through the night there was bustle and commotion in the house. Nobody thought of going to bed. It seemed strange to Sophie to hear nurse someone from her mother's side to supper in the middle of the night, and still stranger that she should go. The necessity of eating and drinking seemed out of place in the house of death. When night was passing into morning, the dining room door opened, and a person's steps were heard along the hall. The superintendent was leaving. At last, Mr. Carson stood on the front doorstep, feeling the refreshment of the cooler morning air, and seeing the starlight fade away into dawn. "You will not forget," said he. "I trust to you." The policeman bowed. "Spare no money. The only purpose for which I now value wealth is to have the murderer arrested and brought to justice. My hope in life now is to see him sentenced to death. Offer any rewards, name £1,000 in the black cards. Come to me at any hour, night or day, if that be required. All I ask of you is to get the murderer hanged next week if possible. Today's Friday. Surely with the clues you already possess, you can muster up evidence sufficient to have him tried next week. he may easily request an adjournment of his trial on the ground of the shortness of the notice. So the superintendent oppose it if possible. I will see that the first lawyers are employed. I shall know no rest while he lives. Everything shall be done, sir. You will arrange with the coroner, 10 o'clock if convenient." The superintendent took leave. Mr. Carson stood on the step, dreading to shut out the light and air, and return into the haunted, gloomy house. My son, he said, at last. But you shall be avenged, my poor murdered boy. I to avenge his wrongs." The murderer had singled out his victim, and with one fell action, taken away the life that God had given to avenge his child's death. The old man lived on with a single purpose in his heart, of vengeance on the murderer. True, his vengeance was sanctioned by law, but was it the less revenge? Are we worshippers of Christ or of Electo, O Orestes? You would have made a very tolerable Christian of the 19th century. Chapter 19, Deeds to be hid which were not hid, which all confused. I could not know whether I suffered or I did. For all seemed guilt, remorse, or woe. Courage, I left Mary on that same Thursday night, which left its burden of woe at M.R. Carson's threshold. Haunted with depressing thoughts all through the night, she tossed restlessly about, trying to get quit of the ideas that harassed her, and longing for the light when she could rise and find some employment. But just as dawn began to appear, she became more quiet and fell into a sound, heavy sleep which lasted till she was sure it was late in the morning. By the full light that shone in, she dressed hastily and heard the neighboring church clock strike 8. It was far too late to do as she had planned, after inquiring how Alice was, to return and tell Margaret, and she accordingly went in to inform the latter of her change of purpose and the cause of it. But on entering the house, she found Job sitting alone, looking sad enough. She told him what she came for. "Margaret wench, why, she's been gone to Wilson's these 2 hours. I sure you did say last night you would go, but she couldn't rest in her bed, so was off the Times this morning." Mary could do nothing but feel guilty of her long morning nap, and hastened to follow Margaret's steps, for late as it was, she felt she could not settle well to her work unless she learnt how kind good Alice Wilson was going on. So eating her crust of bread breakfast, she passed rapidly along the streets. She remembered afterwards the little groups of people she had seen, eagerly hearing and imparting news. But at the time, her only care was to hasten on her way. In dread of a reprimand from Miss Simmons, she went in the house at Jane Wilson's, her heart at the instant giving a strange knock, and sending the rosy flush into her face at the thought that Jem might possibly be inside the door. But I do assure you she had not thought of it before. Impatient and loving as she was, her solicitude about Alice on that horrid morning had not been mingled with any thought of him. Her heart need not have left her collar, need not have rushed so painfully to her cheeks, but he was not there. There was the round table with a cup and saucer, which had evidently been used, and there was Jane Wilson sitting on the other side, crying quietly while she ate her breakfast, with a sort of unconscious appetite, and there was Mrs. Davenport washing away at a nightcap or so, which by their simple old world make. Mary knew at a glance where Alice is, but nothing, no one else. Alice was much the same, or rather better of the two, they told her. At any rate, she could speak, though it was sad. Rambling talk. Would Mary like to see her? Of course she would. Many are interested by seeing their friends under the new aspect of illness, and among the poor there is no wholesome fear of injury or excitement to restrain this wish. So Mary went upstairs accompanied by Mrs. Davenport, wringing the suds off her hands and speaking in a loud whisper, far more audible than her usual voice. "I won't be hastening home, but I'll come again tonight. Time enough to iron her cap. Could be a sin and a shame if we let her go dirty now. She's ill, which has been so rare and clean all her life long. But she's sadly forsaken, poor thing. She not know you, Mary, she knows none of us. The room upstairs held two beds, one superior in the grand yard of 4 posts, and checked curtains to the other, which had been occupied by the twins in their brief lifetime. The smaller had been Alice's bed, since she had lived there, but with the natural reverence to one stricken of guard and afflicted she had been installed, since her paralytic stroke the evening before, in the larger and grande bed, while Jane Wilson had taken her short, broken rest on the little pallet. Margaret came forwards to meet her friend, whom she half expected and whose step she knew Mrs. Davenport returned to her washing. The 2 girls did not speak. The presence of Alice or them into silence. There she lay with the rosy color absent from her face since the days of childhood, flushed once more into it by her sickness. Nigh to death, she lay on the affected side, and with her other arm, she was constantly soaring the air, not exactly in a restless manner, but in a monotonous, incessant way, very trying to a watcher. She was talking away to almost as constantly in a low, indistinct tone, but her face, her profiled countenance looked calm and smiling, even interested by the ideas that were passing through her clouded mind. Listen, said Margaret, as she stooped her head down to catch the muttered words more distinctly. What will Mother say? The bees are turning homeward for the last time, and with a terrible long bit to go yet. Sees a lin. Its nest in his gosh bush. Then bird is on it. Look at her bright eyes. She won't stir. We would hurry home. Won't Mother be pleased with the bonny lot of heather? We've got make a sally. Maybe we shall have cockles for supper. I saw the cockleman's donkey turn up our way for Armside. Margaret touched Mary's hand, and the pressure in return told her that they understood each other, that they knew how in this illness, to the old, world-weary woman, God had sent her a veiled blessing. She was once more in the scenes of her childhood, unchanged and bright as in those long-departed days, once more with the sister of her youth, the playmate of 50 years ago, who had for nearly as many years slept in a grassy grave. In the little churchyard beyond Burton, Alice's face changed. She looked sorrowful, almost penitent. Oh, Sally, I wish we'd told her. She thinks we were in church all morning, and we've gone on deceiving her. If we told her at first how it was, how sweet the old on smell through the open church door, and now we were on the last bench in the aisle. And now it were the first butterfly would see in the spring, and now it flew into the very church itself. Oh, Mother is so gentle. I wish we told her. I'll go to her next time she comes inside and say, Mother, we were naughty last Sabbath. She stopped, and a few tears came stealing down the old, withered cheek at the thought of the temptation and a seat of her childhood. Surely many sins could not have darkened that innocent, childlike spirit, since Mary found a red-spotted pocket handkerchief and put it into the hand which sought about for something to wipe away the trickling tears. She took it with a gentle murmur. Thank you, Mother. Mary pulled Margaret away from the bed. Don't you think she's happy, Margaret? I that I do, bless her. She feels no pain and knows not of a present state. All that I could see, Mary, I try and be patient with her for me. But I'd give all I have to see her and see what she wants. I'm so useless. I mean to stay here as long as Jane Wilson is alone, and I would fain be here all tonight, but I'll come, said Mary decidedly. Mrs. Davenport said she'd come again, but she's hard worked all day. I'll come, repeated Mary. Do, said Margaret, and I'll be here till you come. Maybe Jim and you could date the night between. You and Jane Wilson might get a bit of sound sleep in his bed, for she were up and down the better part of last night, and just when she were in a sound sleep this morning. Between 2 and 3 Jim came home, and the sound of his voice aroused her in a minute. Where had he been till that time of night? Asked marry me, it was none of my business. And indeed I never saw him, to the game and here to see Alice. He were in again this morning, and seemed sadly downcast. But you'll maybe manage to comfort him tonight, Mary," sighed Margaret, smiling while a ray of hope glimmered in Mary's heart. And she almost felt glad for an instant of the occasion, which would at last bring them together. Oh, happy night! When would it come? Many hours had yet to pass. Then she saw Alice, and repented with a bitter self-reproach, but she could not help, having gladness in the depths of her heart, blame herself as she would. So she tried not to think as she hurried along to Miss Simmons with a dancing step of lightness. She was late, that she knew she would be. Miss Simmons was vexed and cross, that also she had anticipated, but she had intended to smooth her raven down by extraordinary diligence and attention. But there was something about the girls she did not understand, had not anticipated. They stopped talking when she came in. Or rather, I should say, stopped listening, for Sally Ledbetter was the talker, to whom they were hearkening with intense attention. At first they eyed Mary, as if she had acquired some new interest to them. Since the day before then they began to whisper, and absorbed as Mary had been in her own thoughts, she could not help becoming aware that it was of her. They spoke. At last, Sally Ledbetter asked Mary if she had heard the news. "No, what news?" answered she. The girls looked at each other with a gloomy mystery. Sally went on. "Have you not heard that young Mr. Carson was murdered last night?" Mary's lips could not utter a negative, but no one who looked at her pale and terror-stricken face could have doubted that she had not heard before of the fearful occurrence. Oh, it is terrible, that sudden information, that when you have known has met with a bloody death, you seem to shrink from the world where such deeds can be committed, and to grow sick with the idea of the violent and wicked man of earth. Much as Mary had learned to dread him lately, now he was dead, and dead in such a manner. Her feeling was that of oppressive sorrow for him. The room went round and round, and she felt as though she should faint. But Miss Simmons came in, bringing a waft of fresh air as she opened the door to refresh the body, and the certainty of a scolding for inner tension to brace the sinking mind. She too was full of the morning's news. "Have you heard any more of this horrid affair, Miss Barton?" asked she as she settled to her work. Mary tried to speak. At first she could not, and when she succeeded in uttering a sentence, it seemed as though it were not her own voice that spoke. "No, ma'am, I never heard of it till this minute." "Dear, that's strange, but everyone is up about it. I hope the murderer will be found out, that I do. Such a handsome young man to be killed as he was. I hope the wretch that did it may be hanged as high as Herman." One of the girls reminded them that the assizes came on next week. I replied, "Miss Simmons and the milkman told me they will catch the wretch and have him tried and hung in less than a week. Serve him right, whoever he is, such a handsome young man as he was." Then each began to communicate to Miss Simmons the various reports they had heard. Suddenly she burst out, "Miss Barton, as I live, dropping tears on that new silk gown of Mrs. Hawk's, don't you know? They will stay in and make it shabby forever," crying like a baby because a handsome young man meets with an untimely end. "For shame of yourself, Miss, mind your character and your work if you please. But if you must cry seeing her scolding, rather increase the flow of Mary's tears. Then otherwise, take this print to cry over. That won't mar like this beautiful silk," rubbing it as if she loved it, with a clean pocket handkerchief, in order to soften the edges of a hard, round drops. Mary took the print, and naturally enough, having had leave given her to cry over it, rather checked the inclination to weep. Everybody was full of the one subject. The girl sent out to match silk. Came back with the account, gathered at the shop of the coroner's inquest. Then sitting the ladies, who called to speak about gowns. First began about the murder, and mingled details of that, with directions for their dresses. Mary felt as though the haunting horror were a nightmare, a fearful dream from which awakening would relieve her. The picture of the murdered body, far more ghastly than the reality, seemed to swim in the air before her eyes. Sally Ledbetter looked and spoke of her, almost accusing me, and made no secret now of Mary's conduct, more blamable to her fellow workwomen for its latter changeableness than for its former giddy flirting. Poor young gentleman, said one, as Sally recounted Mary's last interview with Mr. Carson. What a shame, exclaimed another, looking indignantly at Mary. That's what I call regular jilting to the third. And he lying cold and bloody in his coffin now. Mary was more thankful than she could express when Miss Simmons returned to put a stop to Sally's communications and to check the remarks of the girls. She longed for the peace of Alice's sick room, no more, thinking with infinite delight of her anticipated meeting with Jem. She felt too much shock for that now, but longing for peace and kindness, for the images of rest and beauty in sinless times long ago, which the poor old woman's rambling presented. She wished to be as near death as Alice, to have struggled through this world, whose suffering she had early learned, and whose crimes now seemed pressing close upon her. Old texts from the Bible that her mother used to read, or rather spell out aloud in the days of childhood, came up to her memory, where the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest, the tears shall be wiped away from all eyes, etc. And it was to that world Alice was hasting. Oh, that she were Alice! I must return to the Wilsons' house, which was far from being the abode of peace. That Mary was picturing it to herself. You remember the reward Mr. Carson offered for the apprehension of the murderer of his son. It was in itself a temptation, and to aid its efficacy came the natural sympathy for the aged, parents mourning for their child, for the young man cut off in the flower of his days. And besides this, there is always a pleasure in unraveling a mystery, in catching at the gossiper clue, which will guide to certainty. This feeling, I'm sure, gives much impetus to the police. Their senses are ever and always on the qui-vive, and they enjoy the collecting evidence, and the life of adventure they experience. A continual unwinding of Jack Sheppard romances, always interesting to the vulgar and uneducated mind, to which the outward signs and tokens of crime are ever exciting. There was no lack of clue or evidence. At the coroner's inquest that morning, the shot, the finding of the body, the subsequent discovery of the gun, were rapidly deposed to, and then the policeman who had interrupted the quarrel between Jim Wilson and the murdered young man was brought forward and gave his evidence clear. Simple and straightforward. The coroner had no hesitation. The jury had none, but the verdict was cautiously worded. Willful murder against some person unknown. This very cautiousness, when he deemed the thing so sure as to require no caution, irritated Mr. Carson. It did not soothe him that the superintendent called the verdict a mere form, exhibited a warrant, empowering him to seize the body of Jim Wilson, committed on suspicion, declared his intention of employing a well-known officer in the detective service to ascertain the ownership of the gun and collect other evidence, especially as regarded the young woman about whom the policeman deposed that the quarrel had taken place. Mr. Carson was still excited and irritable, restless in body and mind. He made every preparation for the accusation of Jem. The following morning before the magistrates, engaged attorneys skilled in criminal practice to watch the case and prepare briefs. He wrote to celebrated barristers coming the Northern Circuit to bespeak their services. A speedy conviction, a speedy execution seemed to be the only things that would satisfy his craving first for blood, he would have feigned being policeman, magistrate accusing speaker, or but most of all, the judge, rising with full sentence of death on his lips. That afternoon, as Jane Wilson had begun to feel the effect of a night's disturbed rest of instant frequent droppings off to sleep, while she sat by her sister-in-law's bedside, lulled by the incessant crooning of the invalid's feeble voice, she was startled by a man speaking in the house place below, who, wearied of knocking at the door without obtaining any answer, had entered and was calling lustily for Mrs. when Mrs. Wilson caught a glimpse of the intruder through the stair rails she'd once saw. He was a stranger, a working man. It might be a fellow laborer with her son, for his dress was grimy enough for the supposition. He held a gun in his hand. "May I make bold to ask if this gun belongs to your son?" She first looked at the man, and then, weary and half asleep, not seeing any reason for refusing to answer the inquiry, she moved forward to examine it, talking while she looked for certain old-fashioned ornaments on the stock. "It looks like his, it's his sure enough. I could speak to it anywhere by these marks. You see, it was his grandfather's as a gamekeeper to someone up at north, but they don't make guns so smart nowadays. But how come do you buy it? He sets great store on it. Is he bound for the shooting gallery? He's not for sure now. He's so ill and me left all alone." An immediate cause for her anxiety being thus recalled to her mind, she entered on a long story of Alice's illness, and dispersed with recollections of her husband's and her children's deaths. The disguised policeman listened for a minute or two to glean any further information he could, and then, saying he was in a hurry, he turned to go away. She followed him to the door, still telling him her troubles, and was never struck until it was too late to ask the reason, with the unaccountableness of his conduct in carrying the gun away with him. Then, as she heavily climbed the stairs, she put away the wonder and the thought about his conduct by determining to believe he was some workman with whom her son had made some arrangement about shooting at the gallery, or mending the old weapon, or something rather. She had enough to fret her without murdering herself. About old guns, Jem had given it him to bring to her, so it was safe enough, or if it was not, why she should be glad never to set eyes on it again, for she could not abide firearms. They were so up to shoot people, so comforting herself for her want of thought in not making further inquiry, she fell off into another feverish dream, haunted and unrefreshing. Meanwhile, the policeman walked off with his prize, with an odd mixture of feelings, a little contempt, a little disappointment, and a good deal of pity. The contempt and the disappointment were caused by the widow's easy admission of the gun being her son's property, and her manner of identifying it by the ornaments. He liked an attempt to baffle him. He was accustomed to it. It gave some exercise to his wits and his shrewdness. There would be no fun in fox hunting if Reynard yielded himself up without any effort to escape. Then again, his mother's milk was yet in him, policeman, officer of the detective service though he was, and he felt sorry for the old woman whose softness had given such material assistance in identifying her son as the murderer. However, he conveyed the gun and the intelligence he had gained to the superintendent, and the result was that in a short time afterwards, 3 policemen went to the works, at which Jem was foreman, and announced their errand. The astonished overseer, who directed them to the part of the foundry where Jem was superintending, a casting dark black were the walls, the ground, the faces around them as they crossed the yard, but in the furnace house, a deep and lurid red glad over all. The furnace roared with a mighty flame. The men, like demons in their fire and sword coloring, stood sword around, awaiting the moment when the tons of solid iron should have melted down into fiery liquid, fit to be poured with still heavy sound into the delicate molding of fine, black sand prepared to receive it. The heat was intense, and the red glare grew every instant more fierce. The policeman stood awed with a novel sight. Then black figures holding strange-shaped bucket shovels. Came a thought: the deep red furnace, light and clear and brilliant, flowed forth the iron into the appropriate mold. The buzzer voices rose again. There was time to speak and gasp and wipe the brows. And then one by one the men dispersed to some other branch of their employment. Number B-72 pointed out Jem as a man he had seen engaged in a scuffle with Mr. Carson, and then the other two stepped forwards and arrested him, stating of what he was accused and the grounds of the accusation. He offered no resistance, though he seemed surprised, but calling a fellow workman to him, he briefly requested him to tell his mother he had got into trouble and could not return home at present. He did not wish her to hear more at first, so Mrs. Wilson's sleep was next interrupted, in almost an exactly similar way to the last. Like a recurring nightmare, Mrs. Someone called out from below. Again it was a workman, but this time a blacker-looking one than before. "What don't you want?" said she peevishly. "Only nothing but," stammered the man. A kind-hearted, matter-of-fact person with no invention, but a great deal of sympathy. "Well, speak out, can't you, and have done with it?" "Jem's in trouble," said he, repeating Jem's very words as he could think of. "No others. Trouble," said the mother in a high-pitched voice of distress. "Trouble, God help me. Trouble will never end, I think." "What do you mean by trouble? Speak out, man, can't you? Is he ill? My boy, tell me, is he ill?" In a hurried voice of terror. No. That's not it as well enough. All about me say was, tell. Mother, I'm in trouble and can't come home tonight. Not come home tonight, and what am I to do with Alice? I can't go on. Where in my life are we watching? It might come and help me. I tell you he can't. So the man can't, and he's, well, you say stuff. It's just that he's getting like other young men and wants to go a-larking. But I'll give it him when he comes back. The man turned to go. He does not trust himself to speak in Jem's justification, but she would not let him off. She stood between him and the door as she said, "You shall not go till you've told me what is after. I can see plain enough, you know. And I'll know too before I've done. You'll know soon enough, missus. I'll know now, I tell you what's up, that he can't come home and help me. Nurse me has never got a wink of sleep last night. We're watching. Well, if you will have it out to the poor badgered man. The police have got hold on him, on my Jem," so the enraged mother. "You're a downright liar, and that's what you are. My Jem has never did harm to anyone in his life. You're a liar, that's what you are. Is don't know I'm enough now," said the man, angry in his turn for this good evidence. "He murdered young Carson as was shot last night." She staggered forward to strike the man for telling the terrible truth, but the weakness of old age, of motherly agony overcame her, and she sank down on a chair and covered her face. He could not leave her. When next she spoke, it was in an imploring, feeble, childlike voice. "Oh, master, say you're only joking. I ask your pardon if I vexed you. But please say you're only joking. You don't know what Jem is to me." She looked humbly, anxiously up at him. "I wish I were only joking, missus, but it's true as I say. They've taken him up on charge of murder. It was as good as were found near the place. And one of the police heard him quarreling with Mr. Carson a few days back about a girl. Broke in," the mother once more indignant, though too feeble to show it. As before, her Jem was as steady as. She hesitated for a comparison with to finish, and then repeated, "As steady as Lucifer, and he were an angel. You know, Barjam was not one to quarrel about a girl. But it was that ... though they got a name quite pat the mannered. All they said Mary Barton was her name. Whoever she may be, Mary Button, the dirty horsey. To bring my Jem into trouble of this kind, I'll give it to her well. When I see her that I will, oh my poor Jem. Rocking herself to and fro. And what about the gun? What did you say about that? His gun were found on the spot where the murder were done. That's a lie for one, then a man has. Got the gun now safe and sound. I saw it not an hour ago. The man shook his head. Yes, he has indeed. A friend of Jem's as it lent it to. Did you know the chap? Asked the man, who was really anxious for Jem's exculpation, and caught a gleam of hope from her last speech. No, I can't say as I did. But he were put on as a workman. It may be only one of them. Policeman disguised. No, did never go for. To do that and trick me into telling on my own son, it will be like seeding a kid in its mother's milk. And that the Bible forbids. I don't know, replied the man. Soon afterwards he went away, feeling unable to comfort, yet distressed at the sight of sorrow. She would fate have detained him, but go he would, and she was alone. She never for an instant believed Jem guilty. She would have doubted if the sun were fire first. But sorrow, desolation, and at times anger took possession of her mind. She told the unconscious Alice, hoping to rouse her to sympathy, and then was disappointed, because still smiling and calm, she murmured of her mother and the happy days of infancy. Chapter 20. I saw where stark and cold he lay, beneath the gallows tree, and everyone did point and say it was there he died for thee, O weeping heart, O bleeding heart. What boots thy pity now? Bid from his eyes that shade depart, that death damp from his brow, the battle tragedy. So there was no more peace in the house of sickness, except to Alice, the dying Alice. But Mary knew nothing of the afternoon's occurrences, and gladly did she breathe in the fresh air as she left Miss Simmons' house to hasten to the Wilsons. The very change from the indoor to the outdoor atmosphere seemed to alter the current of her thoughts. She thought less of a dreadful subject which had so haunted her all day. She cared less for the upbraiding speeches of her fellow workwomen. The old association of comfort and sympathy received from Alice gave her the idea that even now her bodily presence would soothe and compose those who are in trouble. Changed, unconscious and absent though her spirit might be, then again she reproached herself a little for the feeling of pleasure she experienced in thinking that he whom she dreaded could never more beset her path, in a security with which she could pass each street, corner each shop where he used to lie in ambush. O beating heart, was there no other little thought of joy lurking within, to gladden the very air? Without was she not going to meet, to see, to hear Jem? And could they fear at last to understand each other's loving hearts? She softly lifted the latch with the privilege of friendship. He was not there, but his mother was standing by the fire staring. Some little mess or other, never mind, he would come soon. And with an unmixed desire to do her grateful duty to all belonging to him, she stepped lightly forwards, unheard by the old lady, who was partly occupied by the simmering, bubbling sound of her bit of cookery, but more with her own sad thoughts and wailing, half-uttered murmurings. Mary took off bonnet and shore with speed, and advancing, made Mrs. Wilson conscious of her presence by saying, "Let me do that for you, I'm sure he won't be tired." Mrs. Wilson slowly turned around, and her eyes gleamed like those of a pent-up wild beast as she recognized her visitor. "And is it thee that dare set foot in this house, after what has come to pass? Is it not enough to erupt me of my boy with thy art, to my profligacy, but that must come here to crawl over me? His mother, dost thou know where he is? Thou bad pussy with a grey blue eyes and yellow hair, to lead men on to ruin outer bondy, with our angel's face thou witted sepulchre. Dost thou know where Jem is all through thee?" No, quivered out poor Mary, scarcely conscious that she spoke, so daunted, so terrified was she by the indignant mother's greeting. "He's lying in New Bailey," slowly and distinctly spoke the mother, watching the effect of her words. As if believing in their infinite power to pain, there he lies, waiting to take his trial from murdering young Mr. Carson. No answer but such a blanched face, such wild distended eyes, such trembling limbs, instinctively seeking support. "Did you know Mr. Carson has now lies dead?" continued the merciless woman. "Fox say you're dead, I knew him but too well, and that for the sake of such as you, my precious child shot you on chap. But he did not, I know he did not. They may hang him, but his mother will speak to his innocence with our last dying breath." She stopped more from exhaustion than want of words. Mary spoke, but in so changed and choked a voice that the old woman almost started. It seemed as if some third person must be in the room. The voice was so hoarse and strange. "Please say it again. I don't quite understand you." "What has Jam done? Please to tell me. I never said he had done it. I said, and I'll swear that he never did do it. I don't care who hurt him quarrel, but if it is his gun as we found near the body, it's not my own Jem as would go for to kill any man. Choose our girl a jilted him, my own good Jem. As was a blessing sent upon the house where he was born." Tears came into the mother's burning eyes as her heart recurred to the days when she had rocked the cradle of her firstborn, and then rapidly passing over events, till a full consciousness of his present situation came upon her, and, perhaps, annoyed at having shown any softness of character in the presence of a Delilah who had lured him to his danger, she spoke again, and in a sharper tone. "I told him to leave off thinking on me, but he would not be led by me. The wench, thou were not good enough to wipe the dust off his feet. A vile flirting queen is thou art as well. Thy mother does not know poor Buddy. What a good for nothing thou art, mother." "Oh, mother," said Mary, as if appealing to the merciful dead. "But I was not good enough for him. I know I was not," added she in a voice of touching humility, for through her heart, when tolling the ominous, prophetic words he had used, when he had last spoken to her, "Mary, you may be heard of me as a drunkard, and maybe as a thief, and maybe as a murderer. Remember, when all I speak in ill of me, you will have no right to blame me. For it's your cruelty that will have made me what I feel I shall become." And she did not blame him. Though she doubted not his guilt, she felt how madly he might act if once jealous of him. And how much cause had she not given him for jealousy, miserable guilty wretch that she was. Speak on desolate mother, abuse her as you will. Her broken spirit feels to have merited all. But her last humble self-abased words had touched Mrs. Wilson's heart sore as it was, and she looked at the snow, pale girl with those prettiest eyes, so hopeless of comfort, and she relented in spite of herself. "Thou seest what comes of light conduct, Mary. It's thy doing that suspicion has lighted on him, who was as innocent as the babin bawn. They'll have much to answer for. If he's young, they'll have my death to at thy door." Harsh as these words seem, she spoke them in a milder tone of voice than she had yet used, but the idea of Jem on the gallows. Jem dead took possession of Mary. And she covered her eyes with her warm hands, as if indeed to shut out the fearful sight. She murmured some words which, though spoken low, as if choked up from the depths of agony, "Jane Wilson Court, my heart is breaking," said she feebly. "My heart is breaking." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Wilson. "Don't talk in that silly way. My heart has a better right to break than yours. And yet I hold up, you see. But oh dear," with a sudden revulsion of feeling, as a reality of the danger in which her son was placed, pressed upon her. "What am I saying? How could I hold up with our work gone, Jem, though I'm as sure as a standard of thy innocence? If they hang thee, my lad, I will lie down and die." She sobbed aloud with bitter consciousness of the fearful chance awaiting her child. She cried more passionately still. Mary roused herself up. "Oh, let me stay with you at any rate till we know the end." Dearest Mrs. Wilson meant to stay, the more obstinately and upbraidingly Mrs. Wilson refused, the more Mary pleaded, with ever the same soft entreating cry, "Let me stay with you." Her stunned soul seemed to bound its wishes, for the hour at least to remaining, with one who loved and sorrowed for the same human being that she did. But no, Mrs. Wilson was inflexible. "I may be being a bit hard on you, Mary. I'll own that, but I cannot abide you yet with me. I cannot but remember it's your giddiness as has brought this war. I'll stay with Alice, and perhaps Mrs. Davenport may come help a bit. I cannot put up with you about me. Good night. Tomorrow I may look on you different. Maybe good night." And Mary turned out of the house, which had been his home, where he was loved and mourned for, into the busy, desolate, crowded street where they were crying happily, broadsides giving an account of the bloody murder, the coroner's inquest, and a raw head and bloody bones, picture of the suspected murderer, James Wilson. But Mary heard not, he did not. She staggered on like one in a dream, with hung head and tottering steps. She instinctively chose the shortest cut to that home, which was to her in her present state of mind only the hiding place of four walls, where she might vent her agony, unseen and unnoticed by the keen, unkind world without, but where no welcome, no love, no sympathizing tears awaited her. As she neared that home, within 2 minutes' walk of it, her impetuous course was arrested by a light touch on her arm, and turning hastily, she saw a little Italian boy with his humble showbox, a white mouse or some such thing. The setting sun cast its red glow on his face. Otherwise, the olive complexion would have been very pale, and the glittering teardrops hung on the long, curled eyelashes. With his soft voice and pleading looks, he uttered in his pretty broken English the word hungry, so hungry, and as if to aid by gesture the effect of the solitary word, he pointed to his mouth with its white quivering lips. Mary answered him impatiently, "Oh, lad, hunger's nothing, nothing," and she rapidly passed on. Her heart upbraided her the next minute with her unrelenting speech, and she hastily entered her door and seized the scanty remnant of food which the cupboard contained, and retraced her steps to the place where the little, hopeless stranger had sunk down by his mute companion, in loneliness and starvation, and it was raining down tears, as he spoke in some foreign tongue, with low cries for the far distant Mamma Mia, with the elasticity of heart belonging to childhood. He sprang up as he saw the food the girl brought. She, whose face lovely in its woe, attempted him first to address her, and with a grateful courtesy of his country, he looked up and smiled, while he kissed her hand, and then poured forth his thanks, and shared her bounty with his little pet companion. She stood an instant, diverted from the thought of her own grief, by the sight of his infantine gladness, and then bending down and kissing his smooth forehead, she left him and sought to be alone with her agony. Once more, she re-entered the house, locked the door and tore off her bonnet, as if greedy of every moment which took her from the full indulgence of painful, despairing thought. Then she threw herself on the ground. Yes, on the hard flag. She threw her soft limbs down, and the comb fell out of her hair, and those bright dresses swept the dusty floor, while she pillowed and hid her face on her arms, and burst forth into hard, suffocating sobs. O earth, that it seemed but a dreary dwelling place for thy poor child, that night none to comfort, none to pity, and self-reproach, knowing at her heart. Oh, why did she ever listen to the tempter? Why did she ever give it her own suggestions and cravings? After wealth and grandeur, why had she thought it a fine thing to have a rich lover? She had deserved it all. But he was the victim, he the beloved. She could not conjecture. She could not even pause to think who had revealed, or how he had discovered, her acquaintance with Harry Carson. It was but too clear. Some way or another he had learned all. And what would he think of her? No hope of his love, oh, that she would give up and be content. It was his life, his precious life, that was threatened. Then she tried to recall the particulars, which when Mrs. Wilson had given them, had fallen but upon a deafened ear, something about a gun, a quarrel, which she could not remember clearly. Oh, how terrible to think of his crime, his blood guiltiness. He would hitherto been so good, so noble, and now an assassin. And then she shrank from him in thought, and then with bitter remorse clung more closely to his image. With passionate self-upbraiding, was it not she who would let him to the pit into which he had fallen? Was she to blame him, she to judge him? Who could tell? How maddened he might have been by jealousy, how one moment's uncontrollable passion might have led him to become a murderer. And she had blamed him in her heart, after his last deprecating, imploring prophetic speech. Then she burst out crying afresh, and when weary of crying fell to thinking again. The gallows black, they stood against the burning light, which dazzled her shut eyes. Press on them as she would, oh, she was going mad. And for a while she lay outwardly still, but with the pulses careering through her head with wild vehemence. And then came a strange forgetfulness of the present, in thought of the long past times, of those days when she hid her face on her mother's pitying, loving bosom and heard tender words of comfort, be her grief or her error what it might, of those days when she had felt as if her mother's love was too mighty not to last forever, of those days when hunger had been to her as to the little stranger she had that evening relieved, something to be thought about and mourned over. When German she had played together, he with the condescension of an older child, and she with unconscious earnestness, believing that he was as much gratified with important trifles as she was. When her father was a cheery-hearted man, rich in the love of his wife and the companionship of his friend. When for it still worked round to that, when mother was alive and he was not a murderer, and then heaven blessed her unaware, and she sang from remembering to wondering unconnected thought, and then to sleep. Yes, it was sleep, though in that strange posture on that hard, cold bed, and she dreamt of the happy times of long ago. And her mother came to her and kissed her as she lay, and once more the dead were alive again. In that happy world of dreams, all was restored to the gladness of childhood, even to the little kitten, which had been her playmate and bosom friend then, and which had been long forgotten. In her waking hours all the loved ones were there. She suddenly wakened clear and wide awake. Some noise had startled her from sleep. She sat up and put her hair, still wet with tears, back from her flushed cheeks and listened. At first she could only hear her beating heart. All was still without for it was after midnight. Such hours of agony had passed away, but the moon shined clearly in at the unshattered window, making the room almost as light as day in its cold, ghastly radiance. There was a low knock at the door. A strange feeling crept over Mary's heart, as if something spiritual were near, as if the dead so lately present in her dreams were yet gliding and hovering round her with their dim, dread forms. And yet why dread? Had they not loved her? And who loved her now? Was she not lonely enough to welcome the spirits of the dead? Who would love her while here, if her mother had conscious being? Her love for her child endured, so she quietened her fears and listened still. Mary opened the door, as a little movement on her part seemed to tell the being outside of her wakeful, watchful state. They were the accents of her mother's voice, which she had sometimes tried to imitate when alone, with the fond mimicry of affection, so without fear, without hesitation. She rose and unbarred the door. There against the moonlight stood a form so closely resembling her dead mother that Mary never doubted the identity, but exclaiming as if she were a terrified child, secure of safety when near the protecting care of its parent. "Oh, mother, mother, you're come at last," she threw herself, or rather fell into the trembling arms of a long lost, Unrecognized Aunt Esther, Chapter 21. My rest is gone, my heart is sore. Peace find I never and nevermore. Margaret's song in Faust. I must go back a little to explain the motives which caused Esther to seek an interview with her niece. The murder had been committed early on Thursday night, and between then and the dawn of the following day, there was ample time for the news to spread far and wide among all those whose duty or whose want or whose errors caused them to be abroad in the streets of Manchester. Among those who listened to the tale of violence was Esther. A craving desire to know more took possession of her mind. Far away as she was from Turner Street, she immediately set off to the scene of the murder, which was faintly lighted by the gray dawn. As she reached the spot, it was so quiet and still that she could hardly believe it to be the place. The only vestige of any scuffle or violence was a trail on the dust, as if somebody had been lying there and then been raised by extraneous force. The little birds were beginning to hop, and twitter in the leafless hedge, making the only sound that was near and distinct. She crossed into the field, where she guessed the murderer to have stood. It was easy of access for the worn, stunted hawthorn hedge had many gaps in it. The night smell of bruised grass came up from under her feet as she went towards the sawpit and the carpenter's shed, which, as I have said before, were in a corner of the field near the road, and where one of her informants had told her it was supposed by the police that the murderer had lurked while waiting for his victim. There was no sign, however, that anyone had been about the place. If the grass had been bruised or bent where he had tried, it had enough of the elasticity of life to raise itself. Under the dewy influences of night, she hushed her breath with involuntary awe, but nothing else told of the violent deed by which a fellow creature had passed away. She stood still for a minute, imagining to herself the position of the parties, guided by the only circumstance which afforded any evidence: the trailing mark on the dust in the road. Suddenly, it was before the sun had risen above the horizon, she became aware of something white in the hedge. All other colors were the same murky hue, that the forms of objects were perfectly distinct. What was it? It could not be a flower that the time of year made clear, a frozen lump of snow, lingering late in one of the Nile tufts of the hedge. She stepped forwards to examine. It proved to be a little piece of stiff writing paper, compressed into a round shape. She understood it instantly. It was the paper that had served as wadding for the murderer's gun. Then she had been standing just where the murderer must have been but a few hours before. Probably as a rumor had spread through the town, reaching her ears, one of the poor, maddened turnouts who hung about everywhere with black, fierce looks as if contemplating some deed of violence. Her sympathy was all with them, but she had known what they suffered, and besides this, there was her own individual dislike of Mr. Carson and dread of him for Mary's sake. Yet poor Mary, death was a terrible, though sure, remedy for the evil Esther had dreaded for her, and how would she stand the shock? Loving as her aunt believed her to do, poor Mary, who would comfort her? Esther's thoughts began to picture her sorrow, her despair, when the news of her lover's death should reach her, and she longed to tell her there might have been a keen grief, yet had he lived. Bright, beautiful came the slanting rays of the morning sun. It was time for such as she to hide themselves with the other obscene things of night from the glorious light of day, which was only for the happy. So she turned her steps towards town, still holding the paper, but in getting over the hedge, it encumbered her to hold it in her clasped hand, and she threw it down. She passed on a few steps, her thoughts still of Mary, till the idea crossed her mind. Could it, blank as it appeared to be, give any clue to the murderer? As I said before, her sympathies were all on that side, so she turned back and picked it up, and then feeling as if in some measure an accessory, she hid it and examined in her hand, and hastily passed out of the street at the opposite end to that by which she had entered it. And what do you think she felt when, having walked some distance from the spot, she dared to open the crushed piece and saw written on it Mary Barton's name? And not only that, but the street in which she lived. True, a letter or two was torn off, but nevertheless there was the name, clear to be recognized. And oh, what terrible thought flashed into her mind. Or was it only fancy? But it looked very like the writing, which she had once known well, the writing of Jim Wilson, who, when she lived at her brother-in-law's, and he was a near neighbor, had often been employed by her to write her letters to people to whom she was ashamed of sending her own misspelled scroll. She remembered the wonderful flourishes she had so much admired in those days, but she sat by it dictating. And Jem, in all the pride of newly acquired penmanship, used to dazzle her eyes by extraordinary graces and twirls, if it were his. Oh, perhaps it was merely that her head was running so unmerry that she was associating every trifle with her, as if only one person wrote in that flourishing, meandering style. It was enough to fill her mind, to think from what she might have saved Mary. By securing the paper, she would look at it just once more and see if some very dense and stupid policeman could have mistaken the name, or if Mary would suddenly have been dragged into notice in the affair. No one could have mistaken the Barton. And it was Jem's handwriting. Oh, if it was. So she understood it all, and she had been the cause. With her violent and unregulated nature, rendered morbid by the course of life she led, and her consciousness of her degradation, she cursed herself for the interference which she believed had led to this for the information and the warning she had given to Jem, which had roused him to this murderous action. How could she, the abandoned and polluted outcast, ever have dared to hope for a blessing, even on her efforts to do good? The black curse of heaven rested on all her doings, were they for good or for evil. Poor diseased mind, and there were none to minister to thee. So she wandered about, too restless to take her usual heavy morning sleep, up and down the streets, greedily listening to every word of the passers-by, and loitering near each group of talkers, anxious to scrape together every morsel of information, or conjecture or suspicion, though without possessing any definite purpose in all this. And ever and always she clenched the scrap of paper, which might betray so much, until her nails had deeply indented the palm of her hand. So fearful was she in her nervous dread, lest unaware she should let it drop towards the middle of the day. She could no longer evade the bodies, craving want of rest and refreshment, but the rest was taken in a spirit vault, and the refreshment was a glass of gin. Then she started up from the stupor she had taken for a pose, and suddenly, driven before the gusty impulses of her mind, she pushed her way to the place where at that very time the police were bringing the information they had gathered with regards to the all-engrossing murder. She listened with painful acuteness of comprehension. Tio dropped words and unconnected sentences, the meaning of which became clearer, and yet more clear to her. Jem was suspected. Jem was ascertained to be the murderer. She saw him, although he absorbed in deep sad thought. Saw her not, she saw him brought handcuffed and guarded. Out of the coach she saw him enter the station. She gasped for breath till he came out, still handcuffed and still guarded, to be conveyed to the New Bailey. He was the only one who had spoken to her, with hope that she might yet win her way back to virtue. His words had lingered in her heart with a sort of call to heaven, like distant Sabbath bells, although in her despair she had turned away from his voice. He was the only one who had spoken to her kindly. The murder, shocking though it was an absent, abstract thing, on which her thoughts could not and would not dwell. All that was present in her mind was gems, danger and his kindness. Then Mary came to remembrance. Esther wondered till she was sick of wondering. In what way she was taking the affair. In some manner, it would be a terrible blow for the poor, marvelous girl with her dreadful father too, who was to Esther a sort of accusing angel. She set off towards the court where Mary lived, to pick up what she could there of information. But she was ashamed to enter in, where once she had been innocent, and hung about the neighboring streets, not daring to question, so she learned but little, nothing in fact, but the knowledge of John Barton's absence from home. She went up a dark entry to rest her weary limbs on a doorstep, and think, her elbows on her knees, her face hidden in her hands. She tried to gather together and arrange her thoughts, but still every now and then she opened her hand to see if the paper were yet there. She got up at last. She had formed a plan, and had a course of action to look forward to that would satisfy one craving, desire at least. The time was long gone by when there was much wisdom. More consistency in her projects. It was getting late, and that was so much the better. She went to a pawn shop and took off her finery. In a back room she was known by the people, and had a character for honesty, so she had no very great difficulty in inducing them to let her have a suit of outer clothes, befitting the wife of a working man, a black silk bonnet, a printed gown, a plaid shawl, dirty and rather worn to be sure, but which had a sort of sanctity to the eyes of the streetwalker, as being the appropriate garb of that happy class to which he could never more belong. She looked at herself in a little glass which hung against the wall, and sadly shaking her head, thought, how easy were the duties of that Eden of innocence from which she was shut out. How she would work and toil and starve and die, if necessary, for a husband, a home for children, but that thought she could not bear. A little form rose up stern in its innocence from the witch's cauldron of her imagination, and she rushed into action again. You know now how she came to stand by the threshold of Mary's door, waiting, trembling until the latch was lifted, and her niece, with words that spoke of such desolation among the living, fell into her arms. She had felt as if some holy spell would prevent her, even as the unholy Lady Geraldine was prevented in the abode of Christabel from crossing the threshold of that home of her early innocence. And she'd meant to wait for an invitation, but Mary's helpless action did away with all reluctant feeling, and she bore or dragged her to a seat, and looked on her bewildered eyes, as puzzled with the likeness, which was not identity. She gazed on her aunt's features in pursuance of her plan. Estimate to assume the manners and character, as she had done the dress of a mechanic's wife, but then to account for her long absence and her long silence towards all that ought to have been dear to her. It was necessary that she should put on an indifference far distant from her heart, which was loving and yearning. In spite of all its faults, and perhaps she overacted her part, for certainly Mary felt a kind of repugnance to the changed and altered aunt who so suddenly reappeared on the scene, and it would have cut Esther to the very core could she have known how a little darling of former days was feeling towards her. You don't remember me, I see, Mary, she began. It's a long while since I left you all, to be sure, and I many a time thought of coming to see you and your father, but I live so far off and I'm always so busy. I cannot do just what I wish. You recollect Aunt Esther, don't you, Mary? Are you Aunt Hetty? Asked Mary faintly, still looking at the face, which was so different from the old recollections of her aunt's fresh, dazzling beauty. Yes, I am Aunt Hetty. Oh, it's so long since I heard that name, sighing forth the thoughts it suggested. Then recovering herself and striving after the hard character she wished to assume, she continued, and today I heard a friend of Yours and of mine too long ago was in trouble, and I guess you would be in sorrow. So I thought I would just step this far and see you." Mary's tears flowed afresh, but she had no desire to open her heart to her strangely found aunt who had, by her own confession, kept aloof from and neglected them for so many years. Yet she tried to feel grateful for kindness, however late from anyone, and wished to be civil. Moreover, she has strong disinclination to speak on the terrible subject uppermost in her mind, so after a pause, she said, "Thank you. I dare say you mean very kind. Have you had a long walk? I'm so sorry," said she, rising with a sudden thought, which was I suddenly checked by recollection. "But I don't think to eat in the house. And I'm sure you must be hungry after your walk." For Mary concluded that certainly her aunt's residence must be far away, on the other side of the town, out of sight or hearing, but after all, she did not think much about her. Her heart was so aching full of other things that all besides seems like a dream. She received feelings and impressions from her conversation with her aunt, but could not put them together, or think or argue about them. And Esther, how scanty had been her food for days and weeks, her thinly covered bones and pale lips might tell. But her words should never reveal. So with a little unreal laugh, she replied, "Oh Mary, my dear, don't talk about eating with the best of everything, and plenty of it, for my husband is in good work. After just supper before I came out, I could not touch him also if you had it." Her words shot a strange pang through Mary's heart. She had always remembered her aunt's loving and unselfish disposition. How was it changed if living in plenty, she had never thought it worthwhile to ask after relations who were all but starving? She shut up her heart instinctively against her aunt, and all the time poor Esther was swallowing her sobs and overacting her part and controlling herself more than she had done for many a long day, in order that her niece might not be shocked and revolted by the knowledge of what her aunt had become, a prostitute and outcast. For she longed to open her wretched heart, so hopeless, so abandoned by all living things, to one who had loved her once. And yet she refrained from dread of the averted eye, the altered voice, the internal loathing, which she feared such disclosure might create. She would go straight to the subject of the day. She could not carry long, but she felt unable to support the character she had assumed for any length of time. They sat by the little round table facing each other. The candle was placed right between them, and Esther moved it in order to have a clearer view of Mary's face, so that she might read her emotions and ascertain her interests. Then she began, "It's a bad business, I'm afraid. This is Mr. Carson's murder." Mary winced a little. "I hear Jim Wilson is taking up for it." Mary covered her eyes with her hands, as if to shade them from the light, and Esther, herself less accustomed to self-command, was getting too much agitated. For calm observation of another, "I was taking a walk near Turner Street, and I went to see the spot," continued Esther, and as luck would have it, aspire this bit of paper in the hedge. Producing the precious piece still folded in her hand. "It has been used as wadding for the gun, I reckon." "Indeed. That's clear enough from the shape it's crumbed into. I was sorry for the murderer, whoever he might be. I did not then know of Jem's being suspected, and I thought I would never leave a thing about as might help, if ever so little, to convict him. The police is so cute about straws, so I carried it a little way. And then I opened it and saw your name, Mary." Mary took her hands away from her eyes and looked with surprise at her aunt's face. As she uttered these words, she was kind after all, for was she not saving her from being summoned and from being questioned and examined, a thing to be dreaded above all others, as she felt sure that her unwilling answers framed them. How she would add to the suspicions against Jem. Her aunt was indeed kind to think of what would spare her this. Esther went on without noticing Mary's look. The very action of speaking was so painful to her, and so much interrupted by the hard, raking little cough which had been her constant annoyance for months, that she was too much engrossed by the physical difficulty of utterance. To be a very close observer, I could be no mistake if they'd found it. Look at your name, together with the very name of this court. And in Jem's handwriting too. I'm much mistaken, look, Mary. And now she did watch her. Mary took the paper and flattened it, then suddenly stood stiff up, with irrepressible movement, as if petrified by some horror abruptly disclosed. Her face strong and rigid, her lips compressed tight. To keep down some rising exclamation, she dropped on her seat as suddenly, as if the braced muscles had in an instant given way, but she spoke no word. "It is his handwriting, isn't it?" asked Esther, though Mary's manner was almost confirmation enough. "You will not tell, you never will tell," demanded Mary in a tone so sternly earnest as almost to be threatening. Mary said Esther rather approachfully, "I'm not so bad as that. Oh, Mary, you cannot think I would do that, whatever I may be." The tears sprang to her eyes at the idea that she was suspected of being one who would help to inform against an old friend. Mary caught her sad and upbraiding look. "No, I know you would not tell, and I don't know what to say. I'm so shocked, but say you will not tell." "Do, no indeed. I will not tell, come what may." Mary sat still, looking at the writing and turning the paper round with careful examination, trying to hope, but her very fears belying her hopes. "I thought you cared for the young man that's murdered," observed Esther half aloud, but feeling that she could not mistake the strange interest in the suspected murderer, implied by Mary's eagerness to screen him from anything which might strengthen suspicion against him. She had come desires to know the extent of Mary's grief for Mr. Carson, and glad of the excuse afforded her by the important scrap of paper. Her remark about its being Jem's handwriting, she had, with this view of ascertaining Mary's state of feeling, felt to be most important the instant after she had uttered it. But Mary's anxiety that she should not tell was too great and too decided to leave a doubt as to her interest for Jem. She grew more and more bewildered, and her dizzy head refused to reason. Mary never spoke. She held a bit of paper firmly, determined to retain possession of it come what might, and anxious and impatient for her aunt to go. As she sat, her face bore a likeness to Esther's dead child. "You're so like my little girl," Mary said, Esther weary of the one subject on which she could get no satisfaction, and recurring with full heart to the thought of the dead. Mary looked up. Her aunt had children then. That was all the idea she received, no faint imagination of the love and the world of that poor creature crossed her mind, or she would have taken her, all guilty and erring, to her bosom, and tried to bind up the broken heart. No, it was not to be. Her aunt had children then, and she was on the point of putting some question about them, but before it could be spoken, another thought turned it aside, and she went back to her task of unraveling the mystery of the paper and the handwriting. Oh, how she wished her aunt would go. As if, according to the believers in mesmerism, the intenseness of her wish gave her power over another. Although the wish was unexpressed, Esther felt herself unwelcome, and that her absence was desired. She felt this some time before. She could summon up resolution to go. She was so much disappointed in this longed-for, dreaded interview with Mary. She'd wished to impose upon her with her tale of married respectability, and yet she'd yearned and craved for sympathy in her real lot, and she had imposed upon her. Well, she should perhaps be glad of it afterwards. But her desolation of hope seemed, for the time, redoubled, and she must leave the old dwelling place, whose very walls and flags, dingy and sordid as they were, had a charm for her must leave the abode of poverty for the more terrible abodes of vice. She would go. Well, good night, Mary. That bit of paper is safe enough with you, I see. But you made me promise I would not tell about it. And you must promise me to destroy it before you sleep. I promise, said Mary hoarsely, but firmly. Then you're going? Yes, not if you wish me to stay, not if I could be of any comfort to you. Mary, catching at some glimmering hope. Oh no, said Mary, anxious to be alone. Your husband will be wondering where you are someday. You must tell me all about yourself. I forget what your name is, Ferguson, sighed Desta sadly. Mrs. Ferguson, repeated Mary half unconsciously. And where did you say you lived? I never did, say Mother Esther, then aloud, in Angels Meadow 140. 5 Nicholas Street, 145 Nicholas Street, Angel Meadow. I shall remember. As Esther drew her shawl around her and prepared to depart, a thought crossed Mary's mind, that she had been cold and hard in her manner towards one who would certainly meant to act kindly in bringing her the paper, that dread terrible piece of paper, and thus saving her from she could not rightly think how much or how little she was spared, so desires of making up for her previous indifferent manner. She advanced to kiss her aunt before her departure, but to her surprise, her aunt pushed her off with a frantic kind of gesture, and saying the words, "Not me, you must never kiss me, you." She rushed into the outer darkness of the street, and there wept long and bitterly. Chapter 22. There was a listening fear in her regard, as if calamity had but begun, as if the vanward clouds of evil days had spent their malice, and the salon rear was with its stored thunder laboring up Pete's Hyperion. No sooner was Mary alone than she fastened the door and put the shutters up against the window, which had all this time remained shaded only by the curtains, hastily drawn together on Esther's entrance and the lighting of the candle. She did all this with the same compressed lips and the same stony look that her face had assumed on the first examination of the paper. Then she sat down for an instant to think, and rising directly went, with a step rendered firm by inward resolution of purpose, up the stairs past her own door, to steps into her father's room. What did she want there? I must tell you. I must put into words the dreadful secret, which she believed that bit of paper had revealed to her. Her father was the murderer. That corner of stiff, shining, thick writing paper she recognized as part of the sheet on which she had copied Samuel Bamford's beautiful lines, so many months ago copied. As you perhaps remember, I'm a blank, part of a valentine sent to her by Jim Wilson, in those days when she did not treasure and hold up everything he had touched as she would do now. That copy had been given to her father, for whom it was made, and she had occasionally seen him reading it over, not a fortnight ago she was sure, but she resolved to ascertain if the other part still remained in his possession. He might, it was just possible, he might have given it away to some friend, and if so, that person was the guilty one, for she could swear to the paper anywhere. First of all, she pulled out every article from the little old chest of drawers. Amongst them were some things which had belonged to her mother, but she had no time now to examine and try and remember them. All the reverence she could pay them was to carry them and lay them on the bed carefully, while the other things were tossed impatiently out upon the floor. The copy of Bamford's lines was not there. Oh, perhaps he might have given it away. But then must it not have been to Jem? It was his gun, and she set to, with redoubled vigor, to examine the deal box, which served as chair and which had once contained her father's Sunday clothes. In the days when he could afford to have Sunday clothes, he had redeemed his better coat from the pawn shop before he left. That she had noticed here was his old one. What rustled under her hand in the pocket? The paper. Oh, father. Yes, it fitted jagged end to jagged end, letter to letter, and even the part which Esther had considered blank had its tallying. Mark with a larger piece its tallies of Ys and GS, and then, as if that were not damning evidence enough, she felt again and found some little bullets or shot, I don't know what she would call them, in that same pocket, along with a small paper parcel of gunpowder, as she was going to replace the jacket. Having abstracted the paper and bullets, etc., she saw a woolen gun case, made of that sort of striped horsecloth you must have seen 1,000 times, appropriated to such a purpose. The sight of it made her examine still further, but there was nothing else that could afford any evidence, so she locked the box and sat down on the floor to contemplate the articles, now with a sickening despair, now with a kind of wondering curiosity. How her father had managed to evade observation. After all, it was easy enough. He evidently got possession of some gun. Was it really Jem's? Was he an accomplice? No, she did not believe it. He never would deliberately plan a murder with another. However, he might be brought up to it by passionate feelings. At the time, least of all, would he accuse her to her father. Without previously warning her, it was out of his nature. Then, having obtained possession of the gun, her father had loaded it at home, and might have carried it away with him sometime, when the neighbors were not noticing, and she was out or asleep, and that he might have hidden it somewhere, to be in readiness when he should want it. She was sure he had no such thing with him when he went away the last time. She felt it was of no use to conjecture his motives. His actions have become so wild and irregular of late that she could not reason upon them. Besides, was it not enough to know that he was guilty of this terrible offense? Her love for her father seemed to return, with painful force, mixed up as it was with horror at his crime. That dear father who was once so kind, so warm-hearted, so ready to help either man or beast in distress, to murder, but in the desert of misery, with which these thoughts surrounded her, the arid depths, of whose gloom she dared not venture to contemplate. A little spring of comfort was gushing up at her feet, and noticed at first, but soon to give her strength and hope, and that was a necessity for exertion on her part, which this discovery enforced. Oh, I do think that the necessity for exertion, for some kind of action, bodily or mental, in time of distress is a most infinite blessing. Although the first efforts at such seasons are painful, something to be done implies that there is yet hope of some good thing to be accomplished, or some additional evil that may be avoided, and by degrees the hope absorbs much of the sorrow. It is the woes that cannot, in any earthly way, the escape that admit least earthly comforting of all trite worn out, hollow mockeries of comfort that was ever uttered by people who will not take the trouble of sympathizing with others. The one I dislike the most is the exhortation not to grieve over an event, for it cannot be helped. Do you think if I could help it, I would sit still with folded hands, content to mourn? Do you not believe that as long as hope remained, I would be up and doing? I mourn because what has occurred cannot be helped. The reason you give me for not grieving is a very and sole reason of my grief. Give me no blur and higher reasons for enduring meekly what my Father sees fit to send, and I will try earnestly and faithfully to be patient. But mark me not nor any other mourner with a speech. Do not grieve, for it cannot be helped. It is past remedy. But some remedy to Mary's sorrow came with thinking. If her father was guilty, Jem was innocent. If innocent, there was a possibility of saving him. He must be saved, and she must do it there. Was not she the sole depository of the terrible secret? Her father was not suspected, and never should be, if by any foresight or any exertions of her own she could prevent it. She did not yet know how Jem was to be saved, while her father was also to be considered innocent. It would require much thought and much prudence, but with a call upon her exertions, and her various qualities of judgment and discretion, came the answering consciousness of innate power to meet the emergency. Every step now near the employment of every minute was of consequence, for you must remember. She had learned at Miss Simmons the probability that the murderer would be brought to trial the next week, and you must remember too, there never was so young a girl, so friendless or so penniless as Mary was at this time. But the lion accompanied Una through the wilderness, and the danger, and so will a high, resolved purpose of right doing ever guard and accompany the helpless. It struck to deep Merk night, it was of no use. Bewildering herself with plans, this weary endless night, nothing could be done before morning. And at first in her impatience, she began to long for day, but then she felt in how unfit a state her body was for any plan of exertion, and she resolutely made up her mind to husband her physical strength. First of all, she must burn the telltale paper. The powder bullets and gun case she tied into a bundle and hid in the sacking of the bed for the present, although there was no likelihood of their affording evidence against anyone. Then she carried the paper downstairs and burned it on the half, powdering the very ashes with her fingers and dispersing the fragments of fluttering black films among the cinders of the grate. Then she breathed again. Her head ached with dizzying violence. She must get quit of the pain, or it would incapacitate her for thinking and planning. She looked for food, but there was nothing but a little raw oatmeal in the house. Still, although it almost choked her, she ate some of this, knowing from experience how often headaches were caused by long fasting. Then she sought for some water to bathe her throbbing temples and quench her feverish thirst. There was none in the house, so she took the jug and went out to the pump at the other end of the court, whose echoes resounded her light footsteps. In the quiet stillness of the night, the hard square outlines of the houses cut sharply against the cold, bright sky, from which myriads of stars were shining down in eternal repose. There was little sympathy in the outward scene with the internal trouble. All was so still, so motionless, so hard. Very different to this lovely night in the country in which I am now writing, with a distant horizon is soft and undulating in the moonlight, and the nearer trees sway gently to and fro in the night wind, with something of almost human motion, and the rustling air makes music among their branches, as if speaking soothingly to the weary ones who lie awake in heaviness of heart. The sights and sounds of such a night lull pain and grief to rest. But Mary re-entered her home after she had filled her picture with a still stronger sense of anxiety and a still clearer conviction of how much rested upon her unassisted and friendless self, alone with her terrible knowledge in the hard, cold, populous world. She bathed her forehead and quenched her thirst, and then with wise deliberation of purpose, went upstairs and undressed herself as if for a long night's slumber. Although so few hours intervened before day dawn, she believed she could never sleep. But she lay down and shut her eyes, and before many minutes, she was in as deep and sound as slumber, as if there was no sin nor sorrow in the world. She awakened as it was natural, much refreshed in body, but with the consciousness of some great, impending calamity. She sat up in bed to recollect, and when she did remember, she sank down again, with all the helplessness of despair. But it was only the weakness of an instant, for were not the very minutes precious for deliberation, if not for action? Before she had finished the necessary morning business of dressing and setting her house in some kind of order, she disentangled her raveled ideas and arranged some kind of plan for action. If Jam was innocent, and now of his guilt, even his slightest participation in or knowledge of the murder, she acquitted him with all her heart and soul. He must have been somewhere else when the crime was committed. probably with some others who might bear witness to the fact, if she only knew where to find them. Everything rested on her. She had heard of an alibi and believed it might mean the deliverance she wished to accomplish, but she was not quite sure, and determined to apply to Job as one of the few among her acquaintance, gifted with a knowledge of hard words, for to her, all terms of law or natural history were alike. Many syllable mysteries, no time was to be lost. She went straight to Joe Blake's house and found the old man and his granddaughter sitting at breakfast. As she opened the door, she heard their voices speaking in a grave, hushed, subdued tone, as if something grieved their hearts. They stopped talking on her entrance, and then she knew they had been conversing about the murder, about Jem's probable guilt, and it flashed upon her for the first time on the new light they would have obtained regarding herself, for until now they had never heard of her giddy, flirting with Mr. Carson. Not in all her confidential talk with Margaret had she ever spoken of him, and now Margaret would hear her conduct talked off by all as that of a bold, bad girl, and even if she did not believe everything that was said, she could hardly help feeling wounded and disappointed in Mary. So it was in a timid voice that Mary wished her usual good moral, and her heart sank within her a little when Job, with a form of civility, bade her welcome in that dwelling where until now she'd been too well assured to require to be asked to sit down. She took a chair. Margaret continued silent. "I'm come to speak to you about this, about Jem Wilson." "It's a bad business, I'm afraid," replied Job. "Sadly, I is bad enough anyhow, but Jem's innocent, indeed he is. I'm sure as sure can be. How can you know? Wench fact spare strong again in poor fellow. The way the deal to put him up and aggravate him. They say I poor lad, he's done for himself, I'm afeard." Job said, Mary rising from her chair and her eagerness. "You must not say he did it. He did not, I'm sure, and certainly didn't. Oh, why do you shake your head? Who is to believe me? Who is to think him innocent, of you who know him so well? Stick to it, he's guilty. I'm lost enough to do it, lass," replied Job, "but I think he's been ill-used and jilted. That's playing truth, Mary. Hard as it may seem, and his blood has been up. Many amount has done the like of all from like causes. Oh God, then he won't help me, Job, to prove him innocent. Oh Job, believe me, Jim never did harm to no one. Not a fool, and mine went. I don't over-blame him for this." Joe relapsed into silence. Mary thought a moment. "Well, Job, you're not refuse me this. I know I won't mind what you think, if you'll help me as if he was innocent. Now suppose I knew he was innocent. It's only supposing, Job. What must I do to prove it? Tell me, Job. Is it not called an alibi, the getting focus where he really was at the time? Best way, if you'd know them innocent, would be to find out the real murderer. Someone did it, that's clear enough. If it was not Jem, who was it? How can I tell?" answered Mary in an agony of terror, lest Joby's question was prompted by any suspicion of the truth. But he was far enough from any such thought. Indeed, he had no doubt in his own mind that Jem had, in some passionate moment, urged on by slighted love and jealousy, being the murderer, and he was strongly inclined to believe that Mary was aware of this, only that too late, repentant of her light conduct, which had led to such fatal consequences. She was now most anxious to save her old playfellow, her early friend, from the doom awaiting the shadow of blood. If Jem's not done it, I don't see as any of us can tell who did. We might find out something if with time, but they say he's to be tried on Tuesday. Is no use siding at Mary, things look strong against him. I know they do. But oh Job, is that an alibi, a proving where he really was at the time of the murder? And how must I set about an alibi? An alibi, is that sure enough? He thought a little. You may ask his mother. His doings and his whereabouts that night. The knowledge of that will guide you a bit, but he was anxious that on another should fall the task of enlightening Mary on the hopelessness of the case, but he felt that her own sense would be more convinced by inquiry and examination than any mere assertion of his. Margaret had sat silent and grave all this time. To tell the truth, she was surprised and disappointed by the disclosure of Mary's conduct with regard to Mr. Henry Carson. Gentle, reserved, and prudent herself, never exposed to the trial of being admired for her personal appearance, and unsusceptible enough to be in doubt even yet whether the flattering, tender, infinitely joyous feeling she was for the first time experiencing at sight or sound or thought of Will Wilson was love or not. Margaret had no sympathy with the temptations to which loveliness, vanity, ambition, or the desire of being admired exposes so many. No sympathy with flirting girls, in short. Then she had no idea of the strength of the conflict between will and principle, and some who were differently constituted from herself. With her, to be convinced that an action was wrong was tantamount to a determination not to do so again, and she had little or no difficulty in carrying out her determination. So she could not understand how it was that Mary had acted wrongly, and it felt too much ashamed, in spite of all internal sophistry, to speak of her actions. Margaret considered herself deceived, felt aggrieved, and at the time of which I am now telling you, was strongly inclined to give Mary up altogether, as a girl devoid of the modest priorities of her sex and capable of gross duplicity, and speaking of one lover, as she had done of Jem, while she was encouraging another in attentions, at best of a very doubtful character. But now Margaret was drawn into the conversation. Suddenly it flashed across Mary's mind that the night of the murder was the very night, or rather the same early morning, that Margaret had been with Alice. She turned sharp round with, "Oh, Margaret, you can tell me. You were there when he came back that night, were you not?" "No, you were not." "But you were there not many hours after. Did not you hear what he had been? He was away the night before too, when Alice was first taken. When you were there for your tea." "Oh, where was he, Margaret?" "I don't know," she answered. "Stay, I do remember something about his keeping Will company in his walk to Liverpool. I can't justly say what it was, so much happened that night." "I go to his mother's," said Mary resolutely. Then neither of them spoke, either to advise or dissuade. Mary felt she had no sympathy from them, and braced up her soul to act. Without such loving aid of friendship, she knew that their advice would be willingly given at her demand, and that was all she really required for Jem's sake. Still her courage failed a little as she walked to Jane Wilson's. Alone in the world with her secret, Jane Wilson's eyes were swelled with crying, and it was sad to see the ravagers which intense anxiety and sorrow had made on her appearance in 24 hours. All night long she and Mrs. Davenport had crooned over their sorrows, always recurring like the burden of an old song to the dreadest sorrow of all, which was now impending over Mrs. Wilson. She had grown, I hardly know what word to use, but something like proud of her martyrdom. She'd grown to hug her grief, to feel its excitement, and her agony of anxiety about her boy. "So Mary, your hero Mary, lest he's to be tried on Tuesday." She fell to sobbing in the convulsive, breath-catching manner which tells so of much previous weeping. "Oh, Mrs. Wilson, don't take on. So we'll get him off, you'll see. Don't fret, they can't prove him guilty." "But I tell thee they will," interrupted Mrs. Wilson, half irritated at the light way as she considered it, in which Mary spoke, and a little displeased that another could hope when she had almost brought herself to find pleasure in despair. "It may suit thee well," continued she, "to make light of the misery that was caused. But I shall lay his death thy door, as long as I live and die. I know he will, and all for what he never did. No, he never did, my own blessed boy. She was too weak to be angry long. Her wrath sank away to feeble, sobbing, and worn-out moans. Mary was most anxious to soothe her from any violence. Of either grief or anger she did so. Wanted to be clear in her recollection, and besides, her tenderness was great towards Jem's mother, so she spoke in a low, gentle tone the loving sentences, which sound so broken and powerless in repetition, and which yet have so much power, when accompanied with caressing looks and actions. Fresh from the heart, and the old woman, insensibly, gave herself up to the influence of those sweet, loving blue eyes, those tears of sympathy, those words of love and hope, and was lulled into a less morbid state of mind. And now, dear Mrs. Wilson, can you remember where he said he was going? On Thursday night he was out when Alice was taken ill, and he did not come home till early in the morning, or to speak true in the night, did he? He went out near upon 5. He went out with Will. He said he were going to set him a part of the way. The Will were hot upon walking to Liverpool, and would not hearken. The Jem's offer of lending him 5 shilling for his fare, so the 2 lads set off together. I mind it all now but the ceased Alice's illness, and this business of poor Jem's drove it out of my head. They went off together to walk to Liverpool. That's to say, Jem were to go a part of the way. But who knows, falling back into the old desponding tone, if he really went he might be led off on the road. Oh, Mary wench, they'll hang him for what he's never done. No, they won't. They shan't. I see my way a bit now. We wouldn't get Will to help. There'll be time he can swear that Jem were with him. Where's Jem? Folks said he were taken to Kirkdale in the prison van this morning without my seeing him. Poor chap, a wench. But they've hurried on the business at a cruel rate. I did not let grass grow under their feet, and hunting out the man that did it, said Mary sorrowfully and bitterly. But keep up your heart, they got on the wrong scent when they talked to suspecting Jim. Don't be afeard, you'll see it will end right for Jim. I should mind it less if I could do out, said Jane Wilson, but I'm such a poor, weak old body, and my head so gone, and I'm so dazed. Like what would Alice, and all that I think, and could do not to help my child. I might have gone and seen him last night. But tell me now, and then I missed it. Oh, Mary, I missed it, and I may never see the lad again. She looked so hideously in Mary's face, with her miserable eyes, that Mary felt her heart giving way, and dreading the weakening of her powers, which the burst of crying she longed for would occasion, hastily changed the subject to Alice and Jane. In her heart, feeling that there was no sorrow, like a mother's sorrow, replied, "She keeps on much the same, thank you, she's happy. But she knows not of what's going on, but the doctor says she grows weaker and weaker. But maybe like to see her." Mary went upstairs, partly because it is the etiquette in humble life to offer to friends a last opportunity of seeing the dying or the dead, while the same etiquette forbids a refusal of the invitation, and partly because she longed to breathe for an instant the atmosphere of holy calm, which seemed ever to surround the pious good old woman. Alice lay as before, without pain or at least any outward expression of it, but totally unconscious of all present circumstances, and absorbed in recollections of the days of her girlhood, which were vivid enough to take the place of realities. To her, still she talked of green fields, and still she spoke to the long-dead mother and sister, low lying in their graves this many a year, as if they were with her and about her in the pleasant places where her youth had passed. But the voice was fainter. The motions were more language. She was evidently passing away. But how happily Mary stood for a time in silence, watching and listening. Then she bent down and reverently kissed Alice's cheek, and drawing Jane Wilson away from the bed, as if the spirit of her who lay there, we get cognizant of present realities, she whispered a few words of hope to the poor mother, and kissing her over and over again, In a warm, loving manner she bade her goodbye, went a few steps, and then once more came back to bid her keep up her heart. And when she had fairly left the house, Jane Wilson felt as if a sunbeam had ceased shining into the room. Yet oh, how sorely Mary's heart ached, for more and more the fell certainty came on her that her father was the murderer. She struggled hard not to dwell on this conviction, to think alone on the means of proving Jem's innocence. That was her first duty, and that should be done. Chapter 23. And must it then depend on this poor eye and this unsteady hand, whether the bark that bears my all of treasured hope and love shall find a passage through these frowning rocks to some fair port where peace and safety smile, or whether it should blindly dash against them and miserably sink. Heaven be my help and clear my eye and nerve, my trembling hand, the constant woman, her heart beating, her head full of ideas which required time and solitude to be reduced into order. Mary hurried home. She was like one who finds a jewel of which you cannot all at once ascertain the value, but who hides his treasure until some quiet hour when he may ponder over the capabilities its possession unfolds. She was like one who discovers the silicon clue which guides to some bow of bliss, and secured of the power within his grasp, has to wait for time before he may tread the labyrinth. But no jewel, no bower of bliss was ever so precious to miser or lover as was the belief which now pervaded Mary's mind, that Jem's innocence might be proved without involving any suspicion of that other, that dear one so dear, although so criminal, on whose part in this cruel business she dared not dwell even in thought. But if she did, that arose the awful question: if all went against Jem the innocent, if judge and jury gave the verdict forth, which had the looming gallows in the rear, what ought she to do, possessed of her terrible knowledge? Surely not to inculpate her father, and yet, she almost prayed for the blessed unconsciousness of death or madness rather than that awful question should have to be answered by her. But now a way seemed opening yet more clear. She was thankful she had thought of the alibi, and yet more thankful to have so easily obtained the clue to Jem's whereabouts. That miserable night, a bright light that her new hope threw over all seemed also to make her thankful for the early time appointed for the trial. It would be easy to catch Will Wilson on his return from the Isle of Man, which he had planned should be on the Monday, and on the Tuesday, or would be made clear, or that she dared to wish to be made clear. She had still to collect her thoughts and freshen her memory enough to arrange how to meet with Will. But are the chances of a letter she would not trust, to find out his lodgings when in Liverpool, to try and remember the name of the ship in which he was to sail. And the more she considered these points, the more difficulty she found they would be in ascertaining these minor but important facts. For you are aware that Alice, whose memory was clear and strong on all points in which her heart was interested, was lying in a manner senseless, that Jane Wilson was, to use her own expression, so expressive to a Lancashireer, dazed, that is to say bewildered, lost in the confusion of terrifying and distressing thoughts, incapable of concentrating her mind, and at the best of times Will's proceedings were a matter of little importance to her, or so she pretended. She was so jealous of all which distracted attention from her pearl of price, her only son Jem. So Mary felt hopeless of obtaining any intelligence of the sailor's arrangements from her. Then should she apply to Jem himself. But no, she knew him too well. She felt how thoroughly he must, and now had it in his power to exculpate himself at another's expense, and his tacit refusal so to do had assured her of what she had never doubted, that the murderer was safe from any impeachment of his. But then neither would he consent, she feared, to any steps which might tend to proving himself innocent. At any rate, she could not consult him, He was removed to Kirkdale, and time pressed already. It was Saturday at noon. And even if she could have gone to him, I believe she longed to do all herself. To be his liberator, his deliverer, to win him life though. She might never regain his lost love. By her own exertions, and oh how could she see him? To discuss a subject in which both knew who was the blood-stained man, and yet whose name might not be breathed by either. So dearly with all his faults, his sins was he loved by both. All at once when she had ceased to try and remember, the name of Will's ship flashed across her mind, the John Cropper. He had named it, she had been sure all along. He had named it in his conversation with her that fatal Thursday evening. She repeated it over and over again, through a nervous dread of again forgetting it, the John Cropper, and then, as if she were arousing herself out of some strange stupid, she bethought her of Margaret, who so likely as Margaret to treasure every little particular respecting Will. Now Alice was dead to all the stirring purposes of life. She had gone thus far in her process of thought when a neighbor stepped in, she with whom they had usually deposited the house key, when both Mary and her father were absent from home, and who consequently took upon herself to answer all inquiries and receive all messages which any friends might make or leave on finding the house shut. Up is somewhat for you, Mary. A policeman left it a bit of parchment. Many people have a dread of those mysterious pieces of parchment. I am one, Mary was another. Her heart misgave her as she took it, and looked at the unusual appearance of the writing, which though legible enough, conveyed no idea to her, or rather, her mind shut itself up against receiving any idea, which after all was rather approved. She had some suspicion of the meaning that awaited her. What is it, Archie? In a voice from which all the pith and marrow of strength seemed extracted. How should I know? Policeman said it. Call again towards evening and see if you gotten it. He would love to leave it, so I tell them who I was, and all about my keeping the key and taking messages. What is it about? Asked Mary again in the same hoarse feeble voice, and turning it over in her fingers as if she dreaded to inform herself of its meaning. Well, you can read word of writing and I cannot, so it's clear I should have to tell you, but my master says it's a summons for you to bear witness again. Jim Wilson at the trial at Liverpool aside. God pity me, said Mary faintly. As white as a sheet, me wench never take on. So what you can say will go a little way, either to help or to hinder. For folks say he's certain to be hung, and sure enough it was to the one was your sweetheart. But Mary was beyond any pain this speech would have given. At another time, her thoughts were all busy, picturing to herself the terrible occasion of their next meeting. Not as lovers meet should they meet well, said the neighbor, seeing no use in remaining with one who noticed her words or her presence so little now. Tell policeman. That was getting his precious bit of paper. He seemed to think I should be for keeping it myself. He's the first as has ever missed out at me about giving messages or notes. Good day. She left the house, but Mary did not know it. She sat still with the parchment in her hand. All at once she started up. She would take it to Job Legg and ask him to tell her the true meaning, for it could not be that. So she went and choked out her words of inquiry. It's a subpoena, he replied, turning the parchment over with the air of a connoisseur. For Job loved hard words and lawyer-like forms, and even esteemed himself slightly qualified for a lawyer, from the smattering of knowledge he'd picked up from an odd volume of Blackstone that he had once purchased at a bookstore. A subpoena? What's that? Gasped Mary, still in suspense. Job was struck with her voice, her changed miserable voice, and appeared at her countenance from over his spectacles. A subpoena is neither more or less than this. My dear, it is, summoning you to attend and answer such questions as may be asked of you regarding the trial of James Wilson. For the murder of Henry Carson, that's the long and short of it, only more elegantly put for the benefit of them who knows out of value of the gift of language. I've been a witness before time myself. There's nothing much to be a fear done. If they are impudent, why just you be impedent and give them tit for tat? Nothing much to be afeared on, echoed Mary, but in such a different tone. I pull when just see how it is. It will go hard with thee a bit to dare say. But keep up thy heart, you cannot have much to tell them. They can go either one way or the other. Maybe that may do him a bit of good. But when they set eyes on thee, they'll see fast enough how we came to be so led away by jealousy about a pretty creature Mary, and one look at their face will let them into the secret of a young man's madness and make them more ready to pass it over. Oh Job, won't you ever believe me when I tell you he's innocent? Indeed, and indeed I can prove it. He was with Will all the night. He was indeed Job, my wench whose word is thou. For that, said Job pityingly, why his mother told me, and I'll get Will to bear witness to it. But oh Job, bursting into tears at his heart, if you won't believe me, how should I clear him to strangers when those who know him and ought to love him are so set against his being innocent? God knows I'm not against this being innocent. So Job solemnly, I'd give half my remaining days on earth. I'd give them all Mary, and but for the love I bear to my poor blind girl, there'd be no great gift if I could save him. You taught me hard, Mary, but I'm not hard at bottom, and I'll help you if I can, that I will right or wrong. He added, but in a low voice, and coughed the uncertain words away. The moment afterwards, oh Job, if you will help me, exclaimed Mary, brightening up though it was but a wintry gleam. After all, tell me what to say when they question me. I shall be so gloppened I shall not know what to answer. Balkans do not. Better than tell the truth. Truth's best at all times, they say. And for sure it is when folk have to do with lawyers. For they're cute and cunning enough to get it out sooner or later, and it makes folk look like Tom Noddies when truth follows falsehood against their will. But I don't know the truth. I can't say rightly what I mean, but I'm sure if I were pent up and stared at by hundreds of folk and asked ever so simple a question, I should be for answering it wrong. If they asked me if I had seen you on a Saturday or a Tuesday or any day, I should have clean forgotten all about it and say the very thing I should not. Well, don't go for to get such notions into your head then. What they call nervous and talking on them does no good. Is Margaret, bless the wench, look Mary how well she guides herself. Joe fell to watching his granddaughter as, with balancing measured steps, timed almost as if to music, she made her way across the street. Mary shrank as if from a cold blast, shrank from Margaret. The blind girl with her reserve, her silence seemed to be a severe judge. She listening would be such a check to the trusting earnestness of confidence, which was beginning to unlock the sympathy of Job. Mary knew herself to blame, felt her arrows in every fiber of her heart, but yet she would rather have had them spoken about, even in terms of severest sincere, than have been treated in the icy manner in which Margaret had received her that morning. He, as Mary said, Job, almost as if he wished to appreciate his granddaughter. Come to take a bit of dinner with us. But I wouldn't. She's never thought of cooking any for herself today, and she looks as wan and pale as a ghost. It was calling out the feeling of hospitality. So strong and warm in most of those who have little to offer, but whose heart goes eagerly and kindly with that little. Margaret came towards Mary with a welcoming gesture, and a kinder manner by far than she had used in the morning. Mary that nose that was getting old at home, urged Job, and Mary faint and weary, and with a heart to aching full of other matters. To be pertinacious in this withdrew her refusal. They ate their dinner quietly, for to all it was an effort to speak. And after one or two attempts, they had subsided into silence when the meal was ended. Joe began again on the subject they all had at heart. Young poor lad at Kirkdale will want a lawyer to see they don't put on him. But do him justice has thought of that. Mary had not, and felt sure his mother had not. Margaret confirmed this last supposition. I have but just been. And poor Jane is like one dateless. So many griefs come on out at once one time. She seems to make sure he'll be young. And if I took her in that way, she flew out poor body, and said that in spite of what folks said, there were them as could and would prove him guiltless. So I never knew where to have her. The only thing she was constant in was declaring him innocent, mother-like said Job. She meant Will when she spoke of. Then that could prove him innocent. He was with Will on Thursday night, walking a part of the way with him to Liverpool. Now the thing is to lay hold on Will and get him to prove this. So spoke Mary calm from the earnestness of her purpose. Don't build too much on it, my dear, said Job. I do build on it, replied Mary, because I know it's the truth. And I mean to try and prove it. Come what may, nothing you can say will daunt me, Job. So don't you go and try, you may help, but you cannot hinder me doing what I'm resolved on. They respected her firmness of determination. And Job almost gave in to her belief when he saw how steadfastly she was acting upon it. O surest way of conversion to our faith, whatever it may be, regarding either small things or great, when it is beheld as the actuating principle, from which we never swerve, when it is seen that instead of over much profession, it is worked into the life and moves every action. Mary gained courage, as she instinctively felt she had made way with one, at least of her companions. Now I'm clear about this much, she continued. Eve was with Will when the shot was fired. She could not bring herself to say, when the murder was committed, when she remembered who it was, that she had every reason to believe was the taker away of life. Will can prove this. I must find Will. He was not to sail till Tuesday. This time enough it was to come back from his uncle's in the Isle of Man. On Monday I must meet him in Liverpool on that day, and tell him what has happened, and our poor Jem is in trouble, and that he must prove an alibi come Tuesday. All this I can and will do, but perhaps I don't clearly know how just at present. But surely God will help me. When I know I'm doing right, I will have no fear, but put my trust in Him. For I'm acting for the innocent and good, and not for my own self who have done so wrong. I have no fear when I think of Jem who is so good. She stopped, oppressed with the fullness of her heart. Margaret began to love her again, to see in her the same sweet, faulty, impulsive, lovable creature she had known in the former Mary Barton, but with more of dignity, self-reliance, and purpose. Mary spoke again. Now I know the name of Will's vessel, the John Cropper, and I know that she's bound to America. That is something to know, but I forget if I ever heard where he lodges. In Liverpool he spoke of his landlady as a good, trustworthy woman, but if he named her name, it slipped my memory. Can you help me, Margaret? She appeals to her friend calmly and openly, as if perfectly aware of and recognizing the unspoken tie which bound her and Will together. She asked her in the same manner in which she would have asked a wife where her husband dwelt, and Margaret replied in the like calm tone, to spots of crimson on her cheeks, alone bearing witness to any internal agitation. He lodges at a Mrs. Jones' milk cow's yard out of Nicholas Street. He has lodged there ever since he began to go to sea. She's a very decent kind of woman, I believe. Well, Mary, I'll give you my prayers, said Job. It's not often a prayer regular, though I often speak a word to God when I'm either very happy or very sorry. I've catched myself thanking Him adult hours when I found a rare insect who had a fine day for an out, but I cannot help it. The more than I can talking to a friend but this time I pray regular for Jim and for you. And so will Margaret, I'll be bound still, wench. What think you of a lawyer and no one? Mr. Cheshire is rather given to insect line, and a good kind of chap he and I have swapped specimens. Many is the time when either of us had a duplicate. He'll do me a kind too, and I'm sure I'll just take my hat and pay him a visit. No sooner said than done. Margaret and Mary were left alone, and this seemed to bring back the feeling of awkwardness, not to say estrangement. But Mary, excited to an unusual pitch of courage, was the first to break silence. "Oh, Margaret," said she, "I see. I feel how wrong you think I've acted. You cannot think me worse than I think myself." Now my eyes opened here, her sobs came, choking up her voice. "May," Margaret began. "I have no right." "Yes, Margaret, you have a right to judge. You cannot help it only in your judgment. Remember mercy, as the Bible says. You, who have been always good, cannot tell how easy it is at first to go a little wrong, and then how hard it is to go back. Oh, a little thought, when I was first pleased with Mr. Carson's speeches, how it would all end, perhaps in the death of him I loved better than life." She burst into a passion of tears. The feelings pent up through the day would have vent, but checking herself with a strong effort, and looking up at Margaret as piteously as if those calm, strong eyes could see her imploring face, she added, "I must not cry, I must not give way. There will be time enough for that hereafter. If I only wanted you to speak kindly to me, Margaret, for I am very, very wretched, more wretched than anyone can ever know. More wretched I sometimes fancy ... than I have deserved. But that is wrong, is not it, Margaret? Oh, I have done wrong, and I am punished. You cannot tell how much." Who could resist her voice, her tones of misery, of humility? Who would refuse the kindness for which she begged so penitently? Not Margaret. The old friendly manner came back with it, maybe more of tenderness. "Oh, Margaret, do you think he can be saved? Do you think they can find him guilty? If Will comes forward as a witness, won't that be a good alibi?" Margaret did not answer for a moment. "Oh, speak, Margaret," said Mary with anxious impatience. "I know not about law or alibis ... replied Margaret meekly. "But Mary, as grandfather says, aren't you building too much on what Jane Wilson has told you about his going with Will? Poor soul, she's gone dateless. I think with care and watching and over much trouble, and who can wonder? Oh, Jem may have told her he was going by way of a blind." "You don't know Jem," said Mary, starting from her seat in a hurried manner, "or you would not say so. I hope I may be wrong, but think, Mary, how much there is against him." The shot was fired with his gun. It was a certain Mr. Carson not many days before. He was absent from home at that very time. As we know, and as I much feared, someone will be called on to prove. And there's no one else to share suspicion with him. Mary heaved a deep sigh. "But Margaret, he did not do it," Mary again asserted. Margaret looked unconvinced. "I can do no good, I see, by saying so, but none of you believe me, and I won't say again till I can prove it. Monday morning I'll go to Liverpool. I should be at hand for the trial, oh dear, dear. And I will find Will, and then Margaret, I think you'll be sorry for being so stubborn about Jim. Don't fly off, dear Mary. I'd give a deal to be wrong. And now I'm going to be playing spoken. You want money, them lawyers is no better than a sponge for sucking up money, let alone your hunting out Will and your keep and Liverpool and what not. You must take some of the mint I've got laid by in the old teapot. You have no right to refuse, but I offer it to Jem, not to you. It's for his purposes you're to use it. I know, I see. Thank you, Margaret. You're a kind one at any rate. I take it for Jim, and I'll do my very best with it for him. Not all, though. Don't think I'll take all they'll pay me for my keep. I'll take this, accepting a sovereign from the hoard, which Margaret produced out of its accustomed place in the cupboard. Your grandfather will pay the lawyer. I have not to do with him. shattering as she remembered Job's words about lawyers' skill in always discovering the truth, sooner or later, and knowing what was the secret she had to hide. "Bless you, don't make such a do about it," said Margaret, cutting short Mary's thanks. "I sometimes think there's two sides to the commandment, and that we may say, 'Let others do unto you as you would do unto them,' for pride often prevents our giving others a great deal of pleasure and not letting them be kind when their hearts are longing to help, and when we ourselves should wish to do just the same. If we were in their place, oh, how often I've been hurt by being coldly told by persons not to trouble myself about their care or sorrow when I saw them in great grief and wanted to be of comfort. Our Lord Jesus was not above letting folk minister to him, for he knew how happy it makes one to do all for another. It's the happiest work on earth." Mary had been too much engrossed by watching what was passing in the street to attend very closely to that which Margaret was saying from her seat. She could see out of the window pretty plainly, and she caught sight of a gentleman walking alongside of Job, evidently in earnest conversation with him, and looking keen and penetrating enough to be a lawyer. Job was laying down something to be attended to, she could see, by his uplifted forefinger and his whole gesture. Then he pointed and nodded across the street to his own house, as if inducing his companion to come in. Mary dreaded lest he should, and she be subjected to, a closer cross examination than she had hitherto undergone, as to why she was so certain that Jan was innocent. She feared he was coming. He stepped a little towards the spot. No, it was only to make way for a child tottering along, whom Mary had overlooked. Now Job took him by the button. So earnestly familiar had he grown, the gentleman looked fidgeting fain to be gone, but submitted in a manner that made Mary like him, in spite of his profession. Then came a volley of last words, answered by briefest nods and monosyllables. And then the stranger went off, with redoubled quickness of pace, and Job crossed the street, with a little satisfied air of importance on his kindly face. Well, Mary, said he on entering, I've seen the lawyer not our Cheshire. Though trials for murder, it seems not his line of business. But he gave me a note to another attorney, a fine fellow enough, only too much of a talker. I could hardly get a word and it got me so short. However, I just been going over the principal points again to him. Maybe he saw us. I wanted him just come over and speak to you himself, Mary, but he was pressed for time and he said, your evidence would not be much either here or there. Is going to the Sizes first train on Monday morning, and we'll see Jim and hear the ins and outs from him. And he's give me his address, Mary, and you and will at a call on him. We'll special on Monday at 2 o'clock about taking it in Mary. About to call on him in Liverpool at 2, Monday afternoon. Job had reason to doubt if she fully understood him, for all this minuteness of detail. These satisfactory arrangements, as he considered them, only seemed to bring the circumstances in which she was placed more vividly home to Mary. They convinced her that it was real and not all a dream, as she had sunk into fancying it for a few minutes, while sitting in the old accustomed place, her body enjoying the rest and her frame sustained by food, and listening to Margaret's calm voice. The gentleman she had just beheld would see and question Jem in a few hours, and what would be the result? Monday, that was the day after tomorrow, and on Tuesday, life and death would be tremendous realities to her lover, or else death would be an awful certainty to her father. No wonder Job went over his main points again. Monday at 2 o'clock, mind, and here's his card, Mr. Bridgenorth, 41 Renshaw Street, Liverpool. You'll be lodging there. Job ceased talking, and the silence roused Mary up to thank him. You're very kind, Job. Very, you and Margaret won't desert me. Come what will. Pooh-pooh, wench, don't lose heart just as I'm beginning to get it. He Seems to think a deal on Will's evidence. You're sure, girls, you're under no mistake about Will? I'm sure, said Mary. He went straight from here, purchasing to go and see his uncle at the Isle of Man and be back Sunday night, ready for the ship sailing on Tuesday. So am I, said Margaret, and the ship's name was the John Cropper, and he lodged where I told Mary before. Have you got it down, Mary? Mary wrote it on the back of Mr. Bridgenorth's card. It was not over willing to go, said she as she wrote. Free knew little about his uncle, and said he didn't care if he never knowed more, but he said kinsfolk was kinsfolk and promises was promises. So it go for a day or so, and then it would be over. Margaret had to go and practice some singing in town. So though loath to depart and be alone, Mary bade her friends goodbye. Chapter 24, O sad and solemn, is the trembling watch of those who sit and count the heavy hours beside the fevered sleep of one they love. How awful is it in the hushed midnight, while gazing on the pallid moveless form, to start and ask, is it now sleep or death? Anonymous. Mary could not be patient in her loneliness. So much painful thought weighed on her mind. The very house was haunted with memories and foreshadowings. Having performed all duties to Jem, as far as her weak powers, yet loving heart could act, and a black veil being drawn over her father's past, present and future life, beyond which she could not penetrate, to judge any of the filial service she ought to render. Her mind unconsciously sought after some course of action, in which she might engage anything rather than leisure for reflection, and then came up the old feeling which first bound Ruth to near me, the love. They both held towards one object, and Mary felt that her cares would be most lightened by being abused or of comfort to his mother, so she once more locked up the house and set off towards Handcoats, rushing along with downcast head for fearless anyone should recognize her and arrest her progress. Jane Wilson sat quietly in her chair as Mary entered, so quietly as to strike one by the contrast it presented to her usual bustling and nervous manner. She looked very pale and worn, but the quietness was the thing that struck Mary most. She did not rise as Mary came in, but sat still and said something in so gentle, so feeble a voice that Mary did not catch it. Mrs. Davenport, who was there, plucked Mary by the gown and whispered, "Never heed, she's worn out and best let alone. I'll tell you all about it upstairs." But Mary, touched by the anxious look with which Mrs. Wilson gazed at her, as if awaiting the answer to some question, went forward to listen to the speech. She was again repeating, "What is this? Will you tell me that?" Mary looked and saw another ominous slip of parchment in the mother's hand, which was rolling up and down in a tremulous manner. Between her fingers, Mary's heart thickened within her, and she could not speak. "What is it?" she repeated. "Will you tell me?" She still looked at Mary with the same childlike gaze of wonder and patient entreaty. What could she answer? "I told you not to heed her," said Mrs. Davenport a little angrily. "She knows well enough what it is to well be like. I was not in when they served it, but Mrs. Ming heard as lives next door was, and she spelled out the meaning and made it all clear to Mrs. Wilson. It's a summons to be a witness on Jem's trial. Mrs. Emming thinks to swear to the gun, for you see, there's nobody else can testify to its being his." And she let on so easily to the policeman that it was his, that there's no getting off her word now. Poor body, she takes it very hard, I dare say. Mrs. Wilson had waited patiently while this whispered speech was being uttered, imagining perhaps that it would end in some explanation addressed to her. But when both were silent, though their eyes without speech or language told their hearts' pity, she spoke again in the same unaltered, gentle voice, so different from the irritable impatience she had been ever apt to show to everyone, except her husband, he who had wedded her, broken down and injured. In a voice so different, I say, from the old hasty manner, She spoke now the same anxious words. "What is this, will you tell me? You better give it me at once, Mrs. Wilson, and let me put it out of your sight. Speak to her, Mary," when she'd ask for a sight on it. "I've tried and better tried to get it from her ... and she takes no heed her words. And I'm loved to pull it by force out of her hands." Mary drew the little cricket out from under the dresser and sat down at Mrs. Wilson's knee, and coaxing one of her tremulous, ever-moving hands into hers, began to rub it soothingly. There was a little resistance, a very little, but that was all. And presently, in the nervous movement of the imprisoned hand, the parchment fell to the ground. Mary calmly and openly picked it up, without any attempt at concealment, and quietly placing it inside of the anxious eyes that followed it with a kind of spellbound dread, went on with her soothing caresses. "She's had no sleep for many nights," said the girl to Mrs. Davenport, "and all this war and sorrow is no wonder. No, indeed, Mrs. Davenport answered, "We must get her fairly to bed. We must get her undressed and all ... and trust to God in His mercy to send her to sleep. Or else, for you see, they spoke before her as if she were not there. Her heart was so far away, accordingly. They almost lifted her from the chair in which she sat, motionless, and taking her up ... as gently as a mother carries her sleeping baby. They undressed her poor worn form, and laid her in the little bed upstairs. They had once thought of placing her in Jem's bed, to be out of sight or sound of any disturbance of Alice's, but then again, they remember the shock she might receive, an awakening in so unusual a place, and also that Mary, who intended to keep vigil that night in the house of mourning, would find it difficult to divide her attention in the possible cases that might ensue. So they laid her, as I said before, on that little pallet bed, and as they were slowly withdrawing from the bedside, hoping and praying that she might sleep and forget for a time her heavy burden, she looked wistfully after Mary and whispered, "You have not told me what it is. What is it?" And gazing in her face for the expected answer, her eyelids slowly closed, and she fell into a deep, heavy sleep, almost as profound a rest as death. Mrs. Davenport went away, and Mary was alone. For I cannot call those who sleep all eyes against the agony of thought which solitude sometimes brings up. She dreaded the night before her Alice might die. The doctor had that day declared her case hopeless, and not far from death, and at times the terror so natural to the young, not of death but of the remains of the dead, came over Mary, and she bent and listened anxiously for the long-drawn, pausing breath of the sleeping Alice or Mrs. Wilson might awaken, a state which Mary dreaded to anticipate, and anticipated while she dreaded, in a state of complete delirium. Already her senses had been severely stunned by the full explanation of what was required of her, of what she had to prove against her son, her Jem, her only child, which Mary could not doubt the officious Mrs. Hemming had given, and what if in dreams that land, and which no sympathy nor love can penetrate with another, either to share its bliss or its agony. That land whose scenes are unspeakable, terrors are hidden, mysteries are priceless treasures to one alone, that land where alone I may see, while yet I carry here the sweet looks of my dead child. What if in the horrors of her dreams, her brain should go still more astray, and she should awaken crazy with her visions and the terrible reality that begat them? How much worse is anticipation sometimes than reality. How Mary dreaded that night, and how calmly it passed by. Even more so than if Mary had not had such claims upon her care. Anxiety about them deadened her own peculiar anxieties. She thought of the sleepers whom she was watching, till overpowered herself by the want of rest, she fell off into short slumbers, in which the night wore imperceptibly away. To be sure, Alice spoke and sang during her waking moments, like the child she deemed herself, but so happily with the dearly loved ones around her, with the scent of the heather and the song of the wild bird, hovering about her in imagination with old scraps of ballads, or old snatches of primitive versions of the Psalms, such as our song in country churches. Half draper it over with ivy ... and where the running brook, or the murmuring wind among the trees, makes fit. Accompaniment to the chorus of human voices, uttering praise and thanksgiving to their God, that the speech and the song gave comfort and good cheer to the listener's heart. And the gray dawn began to dim the light of the rush candle. Before Mary thought it possible, that day was already trembling on the horizon. Then she got up from the chair where she had been dozing and went half asleep to the window to assure herself that morning was at hand. The streets were unusually quiet, with a Sabbath stillness. No factory bells that morning, no early workmen going to their labors, no slipshod girls cleaning the windows of the little shops which broke the monotony of the street. Instead, you might see here and there some operative sawing forth for a breath of country air, or some father leading out his weed, toddling Burns for the unwanted pleasure of a walk with Daddy in the clear, frosty morning. Men with more leisure on weekdays would perhaps have walked quicker than they did to the fresh, sharp air of this Sunday morning, but to them there was a pleasure, an absolute refreshment in the dawdling gait they, one and all of them, had. To be sure, there were 1 or 2 passengers on that morning whose objects were less innocent and less praiseworthy than those of the people I have already mentioned, and whose animal state of mind and body clashed jarringly on the peacefulness of the day. But upon them I will not dwell, as you and I and almost everyone, I think, may send up our individual cry of self-reproach that we have not done all that we could for the stray and wandering ones of our brethren. When Mary turned from the window, she went to the bed of each sleeper to look and listen. Alice looked perfectly quiet and happy in her slumber, and her face seemed to have become much more useful. During her painless approach to death, Mrs. Wilson's countenance was stamped with the anxiety of the last few days, although she too appeared sleeping soundly. But as Mary gazed on her, trying to trace the likeness to her son in her face, she awoke and looked up into Mary's eyes, while the expression of consciousness came back into her own. Both were silent for a minute or two. Mary's eyes had fallen beneath that penetrating gaze, in which the agony of memory seemed every moment to find full vent. "Is it a dream?" the mother asked at last in a low voice. "No," replied Mary in the same tone. Mrs. Wilson hid her face in the pillow. She was fully conscious of everything this morning. It was evident that the stunning effect of the subpoena, which had affected her so much last night in her weak, worn-out state, had passed away. Mary offered no opposition when she indicated by language, gesture, and action that she wished to rise. A sleepless bed is a haunted place. When she was dressed with Mary's help, she stood by Alice for a minute or two, looking at the slumberer. "How happy she is," said she quietly and sadly, all the time that Mary was getting breakfast ready and performing every other little domestic office she could think of to add to the comfort of Jem's mother. Mrs. Wilson sat still in the armchair, watching her silently. Her old irritation of temper and manner seemed to have suddenly disappeared, or perhaps she was too depressed in body and mind to show it. Mary told her all that had been done with regard to Mr. Bridgenorth, all her own plans for seeking out Will, all her hopes, and concealed as well as she could all the doubts and fears that would rise unbidden. To this Mrs. Wilson listened without much remark, but with deep interest and perfect comprehension. When Mary ceased, she sighed and said, "Oh, wench, I'm his mother, and yet I do so little. I can do so little, that's what frets me. I seem like a child who sees its mommy ill, and moans and cries its little heart out, yet does not to help. I think my sense has left me all at once, and I can't even find strength to Cry, like the little child." Hereupon she broke into a feeble wail of self-reproach, that her outward show of misery was not greater, as if any cries or tears or loud, spoken words could have told of such pangs at the heart, as that look and that thin piping altered voice. But think of Mary and what she was enduring. Picture to yourself, for I cannot tell you, the armies of thoughts that met and clashed in her brain, and then imagine the effort it cost her to be calm and quiet, and even in a faint way cheerful and smiling at times. After a while she began to stir about in her own mind for some means of sparing the poor mother the trial, of appearing as a witness in the matter of the gun. They had made no allusion to her summons this morning, and Mary almost thought she must have forgotten it, and surely some means might be found to prevent that additional sorrow. She must see Job about it, May, if necessary. She must see Mr. Bridgenorth with all his truth, compelling powers, for indeed she had so struggled and triumphed, though a sadly bleeding victor at heart over herself. These 2 last days had so concealed agony and hidden her inward woe and bewilderment that she began to take confidence and to have faith in her own powers of meeting anyone with a possibly fair show, whatever might be, rendering her life beneath the cloak of her deception. Accordingly, as soon as Mrs. Davenport came in after morning church to ask after the 2 lone women, and she had heard the report Mary had to give, so much better as regarded Mrs. Wilson than what they had feared the night before. It would have been as soon as this kind-hearted, grateful woman came in, Mary, telling her her purpose, went off to fetch the doctor who attended Alice. He was shaking himself after his morning's round, and happy in the anticipation of his Sunday's dinner, but he was a good-tempered man who found it difficult to keep down his jovial easiness, even by the bed of sickness or death he had missed, chosen his profession for. It was his delight to see everyone around him in full enjoyment of life. However, he subdued his face to the proper expression of sympathy befitting a doctor, listening to a patient or patient's friend, and Mary's sad, pale, anxious face might be taken for either the one or the other. "Well, my girl, and what brings you here?" said he as he entered his surgery. "Not on your own account, I hope. I wanted you to come and see Alice Wilson, and then I thought you would maybe take a look at Mrs. Wilson." He bustled on his hat and coat and followed Mary instantly, after shaking his head over Alice, as if it was a mournful thing for one so pure and good, so true, although so humble a Christian, to be nearing her desired haven, and muttering the accustomed words intended to destroy hope and prepare anticipation. He went in compliance with Mary's look to ask the usual questions of Mrs. Wilson, who sat passively in her armchair. She answered his questions and submitted to his examination. "How do you think her?" asked Mary eagerly. "Why, began he, perceiving that he was desired to take one side in his answer and unable to find out whether his listener was anxious for a favorable verdict or otherwise, but thinking it most probable that she would desire the former, he continued, "She's weak, certainly the natural result of such a shock, as the rest of her son would be, but I understand this James Wilson, who murdered Mr. Carson, was her son. Sad thing to have such a reprobate in the family." "You say who murdered, sir?" sighed Mary indignantly. "Is only taken up on suspicion, and many have no doubt of his innocence. Those who know him, sir." "Ah, well. Well, doctors have sold them down to read newspapers, and I dare say I'm not very correct in my story. I dare say is innocent. I'm sure I had no right to say otherwise. Only words slip out. No, indeed. Young woman, I see no cause for apprehension about this poor creature in the next room. Weak, certainly, but a day or two is good nursing will set it up. And I'm sure you're a good nurse, my dear, from your pretty kind-hearted face. I'll send a couple of bills and a draft, but don't alarm yourself, there's no occasion, I assure you. but you don't think I fit to go to Liverpool?" asked Mary still, in the anxious tone of one who wishes earnestly for some particular decision. "To Liverpool, yes," replied he. "A short journey like that could not fatigue, and might distract her thoughts. Let her go by all means. It will be the very thing for her." "Oh, sir," burst out Mary, almost sobbing. "I did so hope he would say she was too ill to go." "Who?" said he with a prolonged whistle, trying to understand the case. But being, as he said, no reader of newspapers, utterly unaware of the peculiar reasons there might be for so, apparently. "I'm feeling a wish. Why did you not tell me so sooner? It might certainly do a harm in a weak state. There's always some risk attending journeys. Drafts and what not to her. They might prove very injurious. I disapprove of journeys or excitement. In all cases where the patient is in the low, fluttered state in which Mrs. Wilson is, if you take my advice, you will certainly put a stop to all thoughts of going to Liverpool." He really had completely changed his opinion, though quite unconsciously. So desirous was he to comply with the wishes of others. "Oh, sir, thank you, and will you give me a certificate for being unable to go? If the lawyer says we must have one, the lawyer, you know," continued she, seeing him look puzzled. Always to defend Jem, it was a witness against him. "My dear girl," said he almost angrily, "why did you not stay at the case fully at first? 1 minute would have done it, and my dinner. Waiting all this time to be sure she can't go. It would be madness to think of it. If an evidence could have done good, it would have been a different thing. Come to me for the certificate any time. That is to say, if a lawyer advises you, I second the lawyer. Take counsel with both the learned professions." And laughing at his own joke, he departed, leaving Mary accusing herself of stupidity, and having imagined that everyone was as well acquainted with the facts concerning the trial as she was herself. For indeed she had never doubted that the doctor would have been aware of the purpose of poor Mrs. Wilson's journey to Liverpool. Presently she went to Job, the ever-ready Mrs. Davenport, keeping watch over the two old women. I told him her fears, her plans, and her proceedings. To her surprise, he shook his head doubtfully. "It may have an awkward look if we keep her back. Lawyers is up to tricks, but it's not tricks," said Mary. "She's so poorly she was last night at least ... and today she's so faded and weak. Poor soul, I dare say I only mean for Jem's sake. So much is known, it won't do now to hang back. But I'll ask Mr. Bridgedorf. I'll intake a doctor's advice, you carry it home, and I'll come to you in an hour's time. Go your ways." Wench, chapter 25. Something there was what none presumed to say. Clouds likely passing on a smiling day, whispers and tents which went from ear to ear, and a mixed reports no judge on earth could clear. Curious conjectures he may always make, and either side of dubious questions take crab. Mary went home, oh, how her head did ache, and how dizzy her brain was growing. But there would be time enough, she felt, for giving way hereafter. So she sat quiet and still by an effort, sitting near the window and looking out of it, but seeing nothing, when all at once she caught sight of something, which roused her up and made her draw back. But it was too late. She had been seen. Sally LED Bitter flaunted into the little dingy room, making it gaudy, with a Sunday excessive coloring in her dress. She was really curious to see Mary. Her connection with a murderer seems to have made her into a sort of lusus naturae, and was almost by some expected ... to have made a change in her personal appearance. So earnestly did they stare at her, but Mary had been too much absorbed this last day or two to notice this. Now Sally had a grand view and looked her over and over. A very different thing from looking her through and through, and almost learned her off by heart. Her everyday gown oil's print. You know, that lilac thing with a high body she was so fond of. A little black silk handkerchief just knotted round her neck like a boy. her hair all taken back from her face, as if she wanted to keep her head cool. She would always keep that head of hers so long, and her hands twitching continually about. Such particulars would make Sally into a gazette. Extraordinary the next morning at the workroom, and were worth coming for, even if little else could be extracted from Mary. Why, Mary? She began. Where have you hidden yourself? You never showed your face all yesterday at Miss Simmons. You don't fancy we think any the worse of you for what's come and gone. Someone us indeed would a bit sorry for the poor young man, as lies stiff and cold for your sake, Mary. But we shall not cast it up against you. Miss Simmons, too, will be mighty put out if you don't come, for there's a deal of mourning I get. I can't, Mary said in a low voice. I don't mean ever to come again. Why, Mary, said Sally, an unfeigned surprise to be sure. You'll have to be in Liverpool Tuesday, and maybe Wednesday, but after that, you'll surely come and tell us all about it. Miss Simmons knows you'll have to be off those 2 days. But between you and me, she's a bit of a gossip, and we like hearing all how and about the trial. Well, enough to let you off. Very easy for you being absent a day or two. Besides, Betsy Morgan was saying yesterday she should not wonder, but you'd prove quite an attraction to customers, many. One would come and have the gowns made by Miss Simmons, just to catch a glimpse are you. And after the trial's over, really, Mary, you'll turn out quite a heroine. The little fingers twitch worse than ever. The large, soft eyes looked up pleadingly into Sally's face, but she went on in the same strain, not from any unkind or cruel feeling towards Mary, but solely because she was incapable of comprehending her suffering. She had been shocked, of course, at Mr. Carson's death, though at the same time, the excitement was rather pleasant than otherwise, and dearly now would she have enjoyed the conspicuous notice, which Mary was sure to receive, actually like being cross-examined. Mary, not at all, answered Mary when she found she must answer. L.A. What impudent fellows these lawyers are. And the clerks too. Not a bit better, I should not wonder. In a comforting tone, and really believing she was giving comfort. If you picked up a new sweetheart in Liverpool. What gown are you going in, Mary? I don't know and don't care, exclaimed Mary, sick and weary of her visitor. Well then, take my advice and go on. That blue merino, it's old to be sure and a bit worn elbows, but folk won't notice that, and color suits you now, mind, Mary. And I'll lend you my black watered scarf, added she really good-naturedly, according to her sense of things, and with all a little bit pleased at the idea of her pet article of dress figuring away on the person of a witness at a trial for murder. I'll bring it tomorrow before you start. No, don't, said Mary. Thank you, but I don't want it. Why, what can you wear? I know all your clothes as well as I do my own. And what is there you can wear? Not your old plaid shawl. I do hope you would not fancy this to have on more. Another scarf, would you? Said she, brightening up at the thought and willing to lend it. Or anything else. Oh, Sally, don't go on talking of that means. How can I think I'm dressed at such a time when it's a matter of life and death, or to Jem? Bless the girl, it's Jem. Is it? Well, now, I thought there was some sweetheart in the background when you flew off, soared Mr. Carson. Then, what in the name of goodness made him shoot Mr. Harry after you've given up going with him? I mean, was he afraid you'd be on again? How dare you say he shot Mr. Harry? Asked Mary, firing up from the state of language indifference into which he had sunk, while Sally had been settling about her dress. But it's no matter what you think, as did not know him. What grieves me is that people should go on thinking him guilty, as did know him, she said, sinking back into her former depressed tone and manner. "How don't you think he did it?" asked Sally. Mary paused. She was going on too fast, with one so curious and so unscrupulous. Besides, she remembered how even she herself had at first believed him guilty, and she felt it was not for her to cast stones at those who, on similar evidence, inclined to the same belief. None had given him much benefit of a doubt. None had faith in his innocence, none but his mother. And there the heart loved more than the head reasoned. And her yearning affection had never for an instant entertained the idea that her gem was a murderer. But Mary disliked the whole conversation, the subject, the manner in which it was treated were all painful, and she had a repugnance to the person with whom she spoke. She was thankful, therefore, when Joe Blake's voice was heard at the door, as he stood with a latch in his hand, talking to a neighbor, and when Sally jumped up in vexation and said, "There's a old fogey coming in here as I'm alive. Did your father set him to look after you while he was away, and what brings the old chap here? However, I'm off. I never could abide either him or his prim granddaughter. Goodbye, Mary." So far in a whisper, then louder, "If you think better of my offer about the scarf, Mary, just step in tomorrow before 9, and you're quite welcome to it." She and Job passed each other at the door with mutual looks of dislike, which neither took any pains to conceal. "Jan's a bold, bad girl," said Job to Mary. "She's very good-natured," replied Mary, too honorable to abuse a visitor who had only that instant crossed her threshold and gladly dwelling on the good quality most apparent in Sally's character. Aye, good-natured, generous, jolly, full of fun. There are a number of other names ... for the good qualities. The devil leaves his children as bears to catch good uns with. Do you think four could be led astray by one who was everywhere bad? However, that's not what I came to talk about. I've seen Mr. Bridgenorth, and he's in a manner of the same mind as me. He thinks it would have an awkward look and might tell against the poor lad on his trial. Still, if she's ill, and it can't be helped. I don't know if she's so bad as all that," said Mary, who began to dread her part in doing anything which might tell against her poor lover. "Will you come and see a job?" The doctor seemed to say as I liked, not as he thought. That's because he had no great thought on the subject, either one way or to the, replied Job, whose contempt for medical men pretty nearly equaled his respect for lawyers. "But I'll go and welcome. I am not seeing the old lady since their sorrows, and it's but manners to go and axe after them. Come along." The room at Mrs. Wilson's had that still changeless look you must have often observed in the house of sickness or mourning. No particular employment going on, people watching and waiting rather than acting, unless in the more sudden and violent attacks. What little movement is going on ... so noiseless and hushed. The furniture all arranged and stationary, with a view to the comfort of the afflicted, the window blinds drawn down to keep out the disturbing variety of a sunbeam. The same saddened, serious look on the faces of the indwellers. You fall back into the same train of thought with all these associations, and forget the street, the outer world, in the contemplation of the one stationary, absorbing interest within. Mrs. Wilson sat quietly in her chair, with just the same look Mary had left on her face. Mrs. Davenport went about with creaking shoes, which made all the more noise from her careful and lengthened tread, annoying the ears of those who are well, in this instance, far more than the dulled senses of the sick and the sorrowful. Alice's voice was still going on, cheerfully in the upper room, with incessant talking and little laughs to herself, or perhaps in sympathy with her unseen companions, unseen, I say, in preference to fancied, for who knows whether God does not permit the forms of those who are dearest, when living, to hover around the bed of the dying. Job spoke, and Mrs. Wilson answered, so quietly that it was unnatural under the circumstances. It made a deeper impression on the old man than any token of mere bodily illness could have done. If she had raved in delirium or moaned in fever, he could have spoken after his wont, and given his opinion, his advice, and his consolation. No, he was owed into silence. At length, he pulled Mary aside into a corner of the house, place where Mrs. Wilson was sitting, and began to talk to her. "You're right, Mary. She's nowhere as fit to go to Liverpool. Poor soul, now I've seen her I only wonder." The doctor could have been unsettled in his mind. At the first, choose how it goes with poor Jem. She cannot go. One way or another it will soon be over. And best to leave her in the state she is till then. "I was sure you would think so," said Mary. But they were reckoning without their host. They esteemed her senses gone, while in fact they were only inert, and could not convey impressions rapidly. To the overburdened, troubled brain, they had not noticed that her eyes had followed them. Mechanically it seemed at first, as they had moved away to the corner of the room. But her face had the so changeless, had begun to work, with one or two of the old symptoms of impatience. But when they were silent, she stood up and startled them, almost as if a dead person had spoken, by saying clearly and decidedly, "I go to Liverpool. I hear you and your plans, and I tell you, I shall go to Liverpool if my words are to kill my son. They've already gone forth out of my mouth, and nor can bring them back, but I will have faith. Alice up above has often told me I wanted faith, and now I will have it. They cannot. They will not kill my child. My only child. I will not be afeard yet. Oh, I am so sick with terror. But if he is today, thinking up that I will see him again. I see him at his trial when all are hating him. He should have his poor mother near him, to give him all the comfort, eyes and looks and tears, and a heart that is dead to all but him can give, his poor old mother. Who knows how free he is from sin in the sight of man. At least they let me go to him maybe the very minute it's over, and I know many scripture texts, though you would not think it. They may keep up his heart. I missed seeing him early. Went to young prison, but not, she keep me away again. 1 minute when I can see his face, for maybe the minutes are numbered. An account but small, I know I can be a comfort to him. Poor lad, you would not think it now. But he'd always speak as kind and soft to me, as if he were courting me. Like he loved me above a bit, and I might to leave him now, to dray all the cruel slander they'll put upon him. I can pray for him, at each hard word they say against him. If I can do naught else, and he'll know what his mother is doing for him. Poor lad, by the look on my face, still they made some look, or gesture of opposition to her wishes. She turned sharp round on Mary, the old object of her pettish attacks, and said, "Now, wench, once for all I tell you this, he could never guide Emmy. And he'd sense enough not to try what he could not do. Don't you try. I shall go to Liverpool tomorrow and find my lad, and stay with him through thick and thin, and if he dies, why perhaps God of his mercy will take me to the grave." As a sure cure for an aching heart, she sank back in her chair, quite exhausted by the sudden effort she had made. But if they even offered to speak, she cut them short, whatever the subject might be, with the repetition of the same words. "I shall go to Liverpool." No more could be said. The doctor's opinion had been so undecided. Mr. Bridgenorth had given his legal voice in favor of her going, and Mary was obliged to relinquish the idea of persuading her to remain at home if indeed, under all the circumstances, it could be thought desirable. "Best way will be said job for me to hunt. Out will early tomorrow morning, and you, Mary, comin' after with Jane Wilson. I know a decent woman where you two can have a bed, and where we may meet together when I found Will, before going to Mr. Bridgenoff's at 2 o'clock, for I can tell him I'll not trust none of his clerks for hunting up Will, if Jem's life is to depend on it." Now Mary disliked this plan inexpressibly. Her dislike was partly grounded on reason, and partly on feeling. She could not bear the idea of deputing to anyone the active measures necessary to be taken In order to save Jem, she felt as if they were her duty, her right. She does not trust to anyone the completion of her plan. They might not have energy or perseverance or desperation enough to follow out the slightest chance, and her love would endow her with all these qualities, independently of a terrible alternative which awaited her, in case all failed and Jem was condemned. No one could have her motives, and consequently no one could have her sharpened brain, had a sparing determination, besides only that was purely selfish. She could not endure the suspense of remaining quiet, and only knowing the result when all was accomplished, so with the vehemence and impatience, she rebutted every reason Job had used for his plan, and of course, that supposed by what appeared to him willfulness, he became more resolute and angry. Words were exchanged, and a feeling of estrangement rose up between them for a time, as they walked homewards, but then came in Margaret with her gentleness, like an angel of peace, so calm and reasonable, that both felt ashamed of their irritation, and tacitly left the decision to her only. By the way, I think Mary could never have submitted if it had gone against her, penitent and tearful as was her manner, now to Job, the good old man who was helping her to work for Jem. Although they differed as to the manner, Mary had better go, said Margaret to her grandfather in a low tone. I know what she's feeling, and it will be a comfort to her soon. Maybe to think she did all she could herself. She would perhaps fancy it might have been different. Do grandfather let her. Margaret had still, you see, little or no belief in Jem's innocence, and besides, she thought if Mary saw Will and hurt herself from him, that Jem had not been with him that Thursday night, it would in a measure break the force of the blow which was impending. Let me lock up house, grandfather ... for a couple of days and go and stay with Alice. It's but little one like me can do. I know, she added softly ... but by the blessing of God, I'll do it and welcome. And here comes one kindly use of money. I can hire them as will do for her what I cannot. Mrs. Davenport is a willing body, and wouldn't know sorrow and sickness, and I can pay her for her time, and keep her there pretty near. Altogether, so let that be settled, and you take Mrs. Wilson, dear Grandad, and let Mary go find Will, and you can all meet together at after ... and I'm sure I wish you luck. Job consented with only a few dissenting grunts, but on the whole with a very good grace, for an old man who had been so positive ... only a few minutes before. Mary was thankful for Margaret's interference. She did not speak, but threw her arms around Margaret's neck, and put up her rosy red mouth to be kissed. And even Joe was attracted by the pretty, childlike gesture, and when she drew near him afterwards, like a little creature sidling up to some person whom it feels to have offended, he bent down and blessed her as if she'd been a child of his own. To Mary, the old man's blessing came like words of power. Chapter 26. Like a bark upon the sea, life is floating over death. Above, below, encircling the danger looks in every breath. Parted out thou from the grave only by a plank, most frail, tossed upon the restless wave, sport of every fickle gale. Let the skies be e'er so clear, and so calm and still, the sea shipwreck, yet has he to fear who life's voyager will be. Rocket ... The early trains for Liverpool on Monday morning were crowded by attorneys, clerks, plaintiffs, defendants, and witnesses, all going to the assizes. They were a motley assembly, each with some cause for anxiety staring at his heart, though after all that is saying little or nothing, for we are all of us in the same predicament through life, each with a fear and a hope from childhood to death. Among the passengers there was Mary Barton, dressed in the blue gown and obnoxious plaid shawl, common as railroads are now in all places, as a means of transit, and especially in Manchester. Mary had never been on one before, and she felt bewildered by the hurry, the noise of people and bells and horns, the whiz and the scream of the arriving trains. The very journey itself seemed to her a matter of wonder. She had a back seat and looked towards the factory chimneys and the cloud of smoke which hovers over Manchester. With a feeling akin to the Hive, she was losing sight of the familiar objects of her childhood for the first time. And unpleasant as those objects are to most, she yearned after them with some of the same sentiment, which gives pathos to the thoughts of the emigrant. The cloud shadows which give beauty to Chat Moss, the picturesque old houses of Newton. What were they to Mary, whose heart was full of many things? Yet she seemed to look at them earnestly as they glided past, but she neither saw nor heard. She neither saw nor heard tell. Some well-known names fell upon her ear. 2 lawyers' clerks were discussing the cases to come on at her sizes. Of course, the murder case, as it to come to be termed, held a conspicuous place in that conversation. They had no doubt of the result. Juries are always very unwilling to convict on circumstantial evidence. It is true, said one, but here there can hardly be any doubt. If it had not been so clear a case, replied the other, I should have said they were injudicious in hurrying on the trial so much. Still more evidence might have been collected. They tell me, said the first speaker, the people in Gardner's office. I mean that it was really fear. The old gentleman would have gone out of his mind if the trial had been delayed. He was with Mr. Gardner as many as 7 times on Saturday, and called him up at night to suggest that some letter should be written or something done to secure the verdict. Poor old man, answered his companion, open wonder, and only son such a death. The disagreeable circumstances attending it. I have not time to read the Guardian on Saturday, but I understand it was some dispute about a factory girl. Yes, some such person. Of course, she be examined and Williams will do it in style. I shall slip out from our court to hear him, if I can hit the nick of time, and if you can get a place. You mean if it depend upon it, the court will be crowded. Hi, the ladies, sweet souls, will come in shows to hear a trial for murder and see the murderer, and watch the judge put on his black cap, and then go home and groan over the Spanish ladies, who take delight in bullfights, such unfeminine creatures. Then they went on to other subjects. It was but another drop to Mary's cup, but she was nearly in that state which Crabbe describes. For when so full the cup of sorrows flows, add but a drop, it instantly overflows. And now they were in the tunnel, and now they were in Liverpool, and she must rouse herself from the topple of mind and body which was creeping over her. The result of much anxiety and fatigue, and several sleepless nights. She asked a policeman the way to Milk House Yard, and following his directions, with a savoir-faire of a town-bred girl, she reached a little court leading out of a busy, thronged street not far from the docks. When she entered the quiet little yard, she stopped to regain her breath and to gather strength, for her limbs trembled and her heart beat violently. All the unfavorable contingencies she had until now forbidden herself to dwell upon came forward to her mind. The possibility, the bare possibility, of Jam being an accomplice in the murder. The still greater possibility that he had not fulfilled his intention of going part of the way with Will, but had been led off by some little accidental occurrence from his original intention, and that he had spent the evening with those whom it was now too late to bring forward as witnesses. But sooner or later she must know the truth. So taking courage, she knocked at the door of a house. "Is this Mrs. Jones's?" she inquired. "Next door," but one was the curt answer. And even this extra minute was a reprieve. Mrs. Jones was busy washing, and would have spoken angrily to the person who knocked so gently at the door, if anger had been in her nature. But she was a soft, helpless kind of woman, and only sighed over the many interruptions she had had to her business that unlucky Monday morning. But the feeling, which would have been anger in a more impatient temper, took the form of prejudice against the disturber. Whoever he or she might be, Mary's fluttered and excited appearance strengthened this prejudice in Mrs. Jones's mind as she stood stripping the soap sides off her arms, while she eyed her visitor and waited to be told what her business was, but no words would come. Mary's voice seemed choked up in her throat. "Pray, what do you want?" young woman coldly asked Mrs. Jones at last. "I want, oh, is Will Wilson here?" "No, he is not," replied Mrs. Jones, inclining to shut the door in her face. "Is he not come back from the Isle of Man?" asked Mary, sickening. "He never went. He stayed in Manchester too long, as perhaps you know already." And again the door seemed closing. But Mary bent forwards with supply and action, as some young tree bends when blown by the rough autumnal wind, and gasp out, tell me, where is he?" Mrs. Jones suspected some love affair, and perhaps one of not the most credible kind. But the distress of the pale, young creature before her was so obvious, and so pitiable that were she ever so sinful, Mrs. Jones could no longer uphold her short, reserved manner. "He's gone this very morning. My poor girl, step in, and I'll tell you all about it." "Gone?" cried Mary. "How gone? I must see him. It's a matter of life and death. He can save the innocent from being hanged." "It cannot be gone." "How gone?" "Sailed, my dear. Sailed in the John Cropper this very blessed morning. Sailed." Chapter 27. Jan is our key. Parked to the clamor in that mire road, bounded and narrowed by Jan, vessels load the lumbering wealth. She empties round the place, package and parcel hogshead, chest and case, while the loud seaman and the angry hind, mingling in business, bellow to the wind. Crab. Mary staggered into the house. Mrs. Jones placed her tenderly in a chair, and there stood bewildered by her side. "Oh, father, mother, gee, what have you done? What must I do? Must the innocent die? Oh, he whom I fear, oh." "What am I saying?" said she, looking round, frighted and seemingly reassured by Mrs. Jones's countenance. "I'm so helpless, so weak. But a poor girl after all. How can I tell what is right? Father, you've always been so kind to me, ... and you to be. Never mind. All will come right in the grave. Save us and bless us," exclaimed Mrs. Jones. "If I don't think she's gone out of her wits." "No, I'm not," said Mary, catching at the words, and, with a strong effort controlling the mind, she felt to be wondering, while the red blood flushed to scarlet, the heretofore white cheek. "I'm not out of my senses. There's so much to be done. So much, and no one but me to do it. You know, though I can't rightly tell what it is." Looking up with the wilderment to the Mrs. Jones's face. "I must not go mad whatever comes. At least not yet. No," bracing herself up. "Something may yet be done, and I must do it." "Sailed, did you say?" "The John Cropper sailed. She went down the dock last night, ... to be ready for the morning's tide." "I thought she was not to say until tomorrow," murmured Mary. "So did Will his lodge day along, so we all call him." "Will," reply Mrs. Jones. "The mayor told him so, I believe, and he never knew different till he got to Liverpool on Friday morning. But as soon as he heard, he gave up going to the Isle of Man, and just ran over to Real with the mate, one John Harris, as friends a bit beyond Abigelli. You may have heard him speak on him. For they're great jums, though I have my own opinion of Harris."